Hey guys, tonight we begin a softly scented adventure in the pre-dawn hush of a 19th century Parisian bakery, where the first golden rays meet flour-dusted countertops. Think of simple rituals, kneading dough by hand and tipping in purified water, elevated into quiet ceremony. If you enjoy the cozy hush of sleepy history, please like and subscribe. And if you're feeling sociable, share your hometown and your local time in the comments so our sleepy circle spans every time zone. Now, find your favorite spot, dim the lights around you, turn on a gentle fan breeze, and settle in. Let the hush of anticipation lull you. We're about to tiptoe between time-worn ingredients and whispered recipes, exploring dawn's gentle start in Old Paris. Now the story begins. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and focus on the tale. Soon you will drift into restful slumber. The screen now fades to darkness. The oil lamp flickered against the plaster walls, casting long, wavering shadows in the narrow chamber where the master baker roused himself. Through the thin curtains, the darkness beyond the single glazed window was absolute, unbroken by street lamps or passing carriages, for Paris still slumbered in the deep hours before dawn. He awoke to the steady tick of a brass-mounted clock, each second echoing in the hush like a distant footstep in an empty hall. The silence was complete, save for the gentle susurration of an ember still glowing low in the hearth, a faint reminder that yesterday's fire lived on, even in its dying embers. He sat up in the modest bed, the straw mattress sighing as he shifted. A single candle, its base dripped in old beeswax, stood upon the small washstand beside him. Its flame danced thin and pale. He reached for it with deliberate slowness, mindful of the soft crackle as his fingers brushed the wick and the brief wisp of smoke that curled upward. Holding the candle aloft, he rose and approached the wash basin, a simple bowl of earthenware perched on a wooden stand. The cold water from the street pump still lingered in its curve. He cupped his hands and drew it to his face. The liquid was icy, as though drawn from a mountaintop stream rather than the heart of the city. His breath came in a slow exhale as water trickled over his skin, washing from his arms the last traces of sleep and faint ache of yesterday's labors. He paused, letting the water catch the candlelight as he stood motionless. In that moment, the world felt suspended. The swish of silk curtains in distant rooms, the smothered creak of floorboards under his own feet, and the muted drip of water from the basin blended into a soft nocturne. With measured care he washed each hand, fingertips to wrist, pressing gently as though conjuring a day of gentle creativity rather than demanding of his body the strenuous work of kneading. When his hands were clean, he let the water fall away, and then set the basin back on its stand. A faint silver ring of moisture glistened on the dark wood, evidence of a ritual both practical and sacred. He moved next to a simple wooden chest at the foot of the bed. Its lid opened with a soft sigh to reveal carefully folded linen garments, a crisp white shirt, worn now to a pale cream, and a heavy apron of undyed flax. He lifted the shirt with reverence, feeling the slight roughness of the cloth against his fingers. The thread bore the gentle irregularities of hand-spun fibers, each imperfection a testament to the loom and the weaver who had fashioned it. He slipped his arms into the sleeves, fastening each shell button with deliberate tenderness. The linen settled cool against his chest, its folds dropping in neat pleats. He felt the familiar weight of the apron next, thick straps crossed his shoulders and the skirt of it fell almost to his shins. As he tied the apron strings around his waist, the loop of fabric became a kind of talisman, binding him to his craft, marking the transformation from a man at rest to a baker at the dawn of creation. In the corner stood a narrow cupboard whose shelves were lined with every tool he would require. Wooden peels with handles worn smooth by use, brass measuring spoons for salt and sugar, a small leather-bound notebook filled with recipes and observations. He opened the cupboard door with a soft creak and ran his hand along the cool wood of a well-seasoned paddle. The paddle's edges were rounded and glossy, a testament to centuries of kneading and turning, of dough coaxed into life. Next to it lay a finely wrought rasp, used to level flour and inspect the mushy lumps that might hide in its grains. He drew a breath, inhaling the subtle aroma of aged timber and the faint dust of residual flour that clung to the tools like a memory. A small table beside the cupboard bore a kettle of herbal tea already steeping. He poured water from an iron pot into a delicate porcelain cup. The steam rose in gentle wisps, carrying the scent of chamomile, lavender, and a hint of mint. This tea had become his morning ritual long before his hands would meet the rough grain of flour. He lifted the cup to his lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The heat warmed his chest as he savored the sweetness of dried blossoms and the quiet bitterness of steeped herb. Each swallow felt like a soft benediction for the work ahead, a reminder to proceed with patience and respect for the simple ingredients that could transform into sustenance and delight. He leaned for a moment against the edge of the rough-hewn oak plank table, cup still in hand. The candlelight refracted through the liquid, painting his face a gentle amber. In the dim calm, he reflected on the day to come. Soon, the streets would stir with life, hawkers calling their wares, carriage wheels rattling over cobblestones, and neighbors exchanging quick greetings. But for now, he remained suspended in a threshold between rest and labor, where time flowed like honey and every gesture held a quiet ceremony. When the tea was finished, he placed the empty cup back in its saucer and set it on the table. Then he turned toward the wooden peg on the wall where his tools hung. He lifted a small brass scale, its twin pans balanced so precisely that even the faintest leaf of tea could be weighed without tilting the beam. He ran his fingers gently along its central pillar, checking for nicks or dents that might upset its measure. Next came a slender glass vial containing a small quantity of active yeast, wild, harvested days ago and fed with the warmth of his hearth. He touched the cork stopper, feeling its snug fit, and then closed the vial with care, conscious that even the slightest exposure to air could weaken the precious culture within. He paused again, allowing the hush to envelop him. In Paris, they said, no other city stirred so early, so silently. The baker's early hours belonged to a different world from the noisy cafes and the bustle of the markets. Here, at the margin of night and dawn, he found a solitude laced with potential, the promise of dough rising, of crusts crackling in a wood-fire hearth, of fragrant goods carrying warmth into the awakening world. A low knock at the door startled him, a faint, respectful rap. The apprentice, treading on tiptoe, peeked in. His face was still soft with sleep, eyelashes bearing tiny flecks of moisture. With a nod, the baker gave a brief instruction to heat water for the first scald of the oven's bricks. The apprentice slipped away as quietly as he had come, and the baker returned to his own preparation. He gathered the tools he would need in the next hour, the brass scale clasped beneath one arm, the wooden paddle tucked under the other. Each item was placed within reach on the bench alongside a shallow tray of milled wheat flour. He paused over the flour, its fine dust rising in little clouds where he pressed a finger into the soft pyramid. In that moment, he reflected on the cycle that linked soil to storehouse, mill to trough, hearth to table. Soon, this simple white powder would become the very substance around which life in the city revolved. Here, in the still air of the workshop, the day of craft was about to begin. He extinguished the candle and opened the latch of the door, allowing the first threads of approaching morning to seep inside, cool, damp, and carrying the faint tang of dew on stone. He stepped out into the corridor, closing the door behind him with a gentle click. The hush of the small building swallowed him once more as he descended the narrow stair, tool-laden arms steady, heart slowed by the calm ritual that had prepared him for the labor ahead. The world beyond the bakery's threshold lay dark and waiting, its every sound sharpened by the enveloping quiet. And in this sacred stillness, the baker readied himself to awaken ovens and souls alike, one loaf at a time. He steps outside into the gentle hush of early morning, the latch of his front door clicking softly behind him. A thin veil of mist drifts along the narrow lane, curling around iron lanterns and damp wooden shutters like a wispy benediction. He pauses for a moment, one hand still on the heavy brass handle, to lock the door firmly, then slips the key into his coat pocket. The final click echoes beneath low-hanging eaves, and in that instant the small world of his home, walls warmed by hearthlight just an hour before, falls away. He is alone now in the stillness, bearing only the weight of his linen apron, the faded satchel slung across his shoulder, and the faint excitement that stirs his blood as he sets foot onto the cobblestones beyond. The stones are uneven here, worn by centuries of horse hooves and carriage wheels, polished smooth along the raised center, bruised and pitted toward the edges. Each step yields a soft, hollow thump, announced in the silent air. He moves forward with steady purpose, his breath faintly visible in the cool air, clouds of vapor drifting upward and dissolving among the rooftops. Overhead, oil lanterns hang in battered iron brackets, their tins emitting a pale, tremulous glow that casts long, flickering shadows across the walls. The light pools in small circles upon the stones, and between these oases of warmth lie deeper pockets of darkness, empty doorways, shuttered windows, door knockers the shape of beasts frozen in perpetuity. He walks with measured strides, letting his senses roam freely. The distant toll of a church bell drifts across the rooftops, each knell resonating deep within his chest. He counts the strokes, 1, 2, 3, 12 in all, marking the hour before dawn. Occasionally he hears the rustle of a stray cat slipping along the gutter, or the faint scrape of a drayman's barrow creeping down a side street. But for the most part, his world is still. Only the occasional sigh of wind stirring the river's worn planks and the soft whisper of his own footsteps ripple through the city. He passes the row of shuttered cafes where the black enameled signs hang like closed eyes against the walls. Their hinged doors are sealed, windows curtained with heavy drapes to keep out both the cold and curious gazes. Outside, a small basin fountain stands at the corner of Rue de la Tête d'Or, a cast-iron basin catching droplets of yesterday's rain, now iced at the edges in fragile lacy patterns. Water no longer flows, but the fountain's curved spouts remain as silent sentinels, its stone ledge bearing the weight of a single fallen leaf, curled and brittle in the low lamplight. He lifts his chin, drawing in a slow, deliberate breath. The air tastes of damp stone, a faint tang of residual embers from hearths left to smolder overnight, and something subtly sweet, perhaps the mingled fragrance of dried chestnuts roasting in back alleys at the faintest hint of sunrise. He inhales again, feeling the cool moisture fill his lungs, and exhales patiently, letting every worry slip away. In this liminal hour, the world is hushed, unspoiled by the realities that will awaken soon enough. It is a moment of communion between himself and the city, two beings breathing in concert, sharing rhythm, pulse, and stillness. Later, as he advances deeper into the quartier, the street widens, revealing tall, narrow facades crowned with slate roofs. The wrought iron balconies cast skeletal silhouettes against pale stone walls. Dark windows with heavy shutters gaze back at him, impassive. A stray beam of lamp light flickers across the face of a weathered relief, a carved fleur-de-lis above a doorway, half hidden by ivy long dead in winter. He reaches out, brushing his fingertips against the cold metal of a locket hanging at the doorpost, a relic from some bygone celebration, before continuing on his way. The route is familiar, yet each journey feels subtlety new. At the next corner, the faint murmur of distant labor begins to emerge, the bark of a watchman calling out the hour, the muted clang of metal as the blacksmith on Rue de Bars tests the hardness of a newly wrought horseshoe. Though the forge flames lie dormant now, its stone walls still carry the faint smell of coal and iron. He pauses a moment on the threshold of that lingering aroma, recalling the spark of colors, the almost rhythmic pulse of hammer upon anvil that will not break life's quiet here for another hour or so. Further on, he passes a row of elegant townhouses, their ground floor shops still shuttered. One bears a neat hand-lettered sign reading, Charcuterie, Volails Fresh, but the windows are dark, concealing counters once laden with roasted birds and cured meats. Across the way, a modest bookseller's facade displays a gilded letter, B, though the shelves behind remain empty of all but the glow of distant lamps. Through wrought iron grills, he glimpses a single volume open on a desk, held in place by a ceramic inkwell. Ink has dried into patterns across the page, as if the writer rose for the morning and slipped away before finishing a thought. He continues past a small square, where a fountain stands centered among iron railings, its waters stilled. Marble statues of nymphs and cherubs, greened at the edges with moss, face one another in eternal embrace. The lamp overhead, the last before his destination, casts a halo of light across the figures, illuminating their gentle curves in a way that seems almost sacred. He stops, allowing the motionless water to whisper to him in rhythmic silence. Here, too, his reflection rests for a moment on the water's surface, a dark silhouette with a thin slash of candlelit gown across his chest, and then dissolves as he steps away. At length, he comes upon the bakery's worn wooden door. Its thick boards show years of careful handling, a smoothed surface where many hands have passed, small nicks at the edges, a weathered spot where the apron of each morning's bakers has rubbed against it. Two iron hinges, each loop welded centuries ago, hold the door steadfast within the stone frame. He pauses, gathering the lingering coolness of the night around him, and wraps his fingers around the brass ring of the latch. His breath deepens as he exhales in gentle anticipation of the work ahead, the old rhythm of dough, fire, and flour that awaits behind these doors. He does not open it yet. Instead, he stands just beyond the threshold, allowing one final moment of the city's slumber to press against him. The lantern above flickers once more, and in its glow he sees the faint shape of the wood-fired hearth inside, dark and silent. He hears nothing beyond the solid thickness of walls and door, no stirring of staff, no hum of activity. The world is holding its breath, as he is. And in that stillness lies the promise of a new day, awaiting the spark of embers, the scrape of shovel on coal, the slow unfolding of life from grain and water. Thus ends his moonlit journey. Soon he will cross this threshold, step into the cool shadow of the bakery's hearth, and rekindle the old flame that brings warmth, scent, and sustenance to the waking city. But for now, he lingers in that delicate space between night and dawn, a solitary figure in a sleeping Paris, breathing in the calm before creation. The bakery's facade stood silent under the pre-dawn sky, its shutters still drawn against the lingering chill of night. A veil of dim blue cloaked the empty street, broken only by the faint glow of a solitary lamp swinging upon its wrought iron bracket. The master baker paused before the heavy door, his gloved hand resting for a moment upon the cold wood, feeling the faint pulse of residual warmth, the ember of hope that lay smoldering behind it. He inhaled deeply, the scent of ash and aged timber mingling with the distant scent of dew on stone. Then, with deliberate care, he pressed his shoulder against the door and slid it open. The movement was slow, measured. The great oak door, bound with blackened iron straps, responded with a low, grumbling creak. In that sound lay all the promise of creation, the threshold between winter's hush and the radiant birth of morning loaves. He paused at the entrance, letting the darkness greet him, as if the bakery itself were a sleeping creature that stirred at his presence. The interior lay in gentle shadow, walls of rough plaster and stone barely visible beyond the circle of lantern light he carried in his hand. Stepping inside, he set the lantern upon a small wooden hook beside the arched alcove of the hearth. Its flame flickered to life, casting a warm pool of yellow upon the uneven flagstones underfoot. He pulled back the iron shutter, a thick, slatted barrier that protected the oven's mouth from the wind, revealing the cavernous interior of the wood-fired hearth. Inside, a small bed of ashes lay cool and gray, testament to the previous day's labors and the night's slow extinguishment. The baker knelt before the hearth, his linen shirt riding up slightly at the waist, revealing calloused hands that had kneaded countless batches of dough. With a sigh barely louder than a whisper, he reached for the brass bellows that hung at his side. Polished through years of use, the brass shone even in the half-light, its seams and rivets smooth from constant handling. Lifting it gently, he brought its nozzle to the heart of the ashen bed. Each pump of the bellows spoke a quiet story of patience. The first breath of air stirred a faint glow, a timid flicker of orange beneath the cinder. He worked with a measured rhythm, neither hurried nor slow, but steady, fanning the embers with exactly the right balance of force. The graying ash stirred, bright veins of red tracing back along it, as though ancient vines reborn. The smell of wood smoke deepened, a heady perfume that spoke of forests long since felled and stoked into life once more for the sake of sustenance. He paused, setting the bellows aside, and picked up a slender poker rod of wrought iron. The instrument was simple, its shaft burnished by years of contact with glowing wood, its hooked end slightly bent from careful practice. With the poker, he turned the coals and sifted away any remnants of unburnt bark, seeking to distribute the heat evenly across the hearth's floor. Small creatures of flame leapt at the motion, embers rose, swirled, then settled in luminous craters against the black brick. From a nearby corner he selected the first of the logs, a chunk of seasoned oak, its surface rough with splintered grain, cut at the cooperage that served the city's casks. He tested its dryness by striking it gently against the hearthstone, a crisp crack answered, and fine dust fluffed into the lantern light like tiny golden sparks. Carefully, he slid the log into the heart of the coals, positioning it so as not to smother the smoldering threads but to encourage them to flare. More logs followed, each chosen for its length and density. A maple billet with mottled bark, a length of beech with a silvery sheen, each wood carried its own flavor on the smoke it produced, subtle layers that would impart nuance to the crust of the bread to come. He worked with the quiet concentration of a woodcarver shaping a masterpiece. The logs formed an arch across the hearth floor, supporting one another like solemn guardians of the flame. As the wood caught, a soft crackling began. The first tongues of flame danced at the edges of the coals, finding purchase on the dry bark. Wisps of smoke, pale and ephemeral, curled upward, illuminating the lofted timbers of the bakery's ceiling before disappearing into the chimney's arched throat. A gentle heat radiated outward, warming the baker's face and hands with discreet insistence. He stood, brushing ash from his trousers, and watched for a moment as the fire coaxed the black bricks into a deep, shining red. The silence in the bakery was profound. Outside, the city remained wrapped in slumber, only a distant church bell tolled once, twice, in the half-awakened air. Inside, the lantern's glow pulsed in harmony with the newly kindled hearth. The baker allowed himself this quiet vigil, recognizing that the fire's first breaths were as delicate as newborn life. He refilled the bellows and gave one more gentle breath, just enough to send a ribbon of flame licking up the wall of the oven's arch. It was in these early moments, long before dawn, that the baker felt himself most connected to the centuries of tradition that defined his craft. The simple act of rekindling the hearth was not merely a practical necessity, it was an homage to every hand that had fed Paris before him, to every ember that had coaxed grain into bread. He turned then to the wooden table beside the hearth, where a small square of rough linen cloth lay waiting. Folding it back, he revealed a handful of kindling, slender twigs of birch and cedar, gathered from an earlier trip to the woodpile. One by one, he placed the kindling atop the glowing logs. The fire, now strong enough to dry their fibrous core, drew in the fresh fuel greedily. Crackles grew more insistent, the hearth's interior glowed like molten metal. The baker drew a soft breath, satisfied that the oven had come fully back to life. He laid aside the poker, stepping back so that the warmth could embrace the entire workshop. Under the hearth's radiance, the cold stones shed their overnight chill and the rafters overhead sighed contentedly. Minutes passed. The flicker of flame stretched across the floor, dancing on the rough mortar between the bricks, casting shadows that swayed in time with the firelight. The baker, sensing the right moment, reached for a long-handled broom of stiff bristles. He swept the hearth floor clean of loose ash and debris, preparing the surface for the first stones of dough that would soon rest there. This final act of clearing the hearth mirrored the opening of a stage for the performance of bread-making. With the hearth now forging a steady blaze, the baker turned slowly to survey the empty shelves and unopened sacks that awaited him. The ingredients of tomorrow's loaves stood silent in their sacks, the dough's alchemy yet to begin. But for this single, perfect instant, the forgotten hour belonged wholly to the hearth. In its glow lay every promise, the crack of crust, the scent of rising dough, the hush of satisfied mouths in the new morning. He retrieved his lantern from its hook and placed it upon the bench beside the hearth, its light augmenting the fire's radiance. The bakery, in this moment, felt like a living vessel, its heart ignited and ready. Outside, the first pale hint of dawn brushed the eastern sky, and the master baker, content, allowed himself a final, silent nod to the flames. The day's work would begin soon. For now, the hearth burned, bright and unwavering, welcoming the slow art that was about to unfold. Under the low, golden glow of oil lanterns, the bakery's main room felt transformed. Every surface, wooden counters, iron tools, rough-hewn beams overhead, took on a soft, amber hue. The hearth's warmth had spread beyond its immediate embrace, chasing away the damp chill that clung to corners. Here, in this hushed hour, the baker moved with deliberate calm, as though time itself had slowed its relentless march. The aromas of smoldering oak and warmed stone mingled with the distant memory of last evening's coals, lending the air a quiet comfort. In this gentle half-light, he prepared to turn simple elements, grain, water, salt, yeast, into daily sustenance for Paris. He stepped toward a row of neatly stacked burlap sacks that lay awaiting attention in the far corner. Each sack bore the dusty imprint of a miller's stamp, dates, batch numbers, the faint flourish of a Parisian emblem. Coarse fibers scratched at his palms as he tugged open the topmost bag. A muted rustle echoed against the brick walls. He paused, inhaling deeply. The scent rose like a memory of sunlit fields beyond the city walls, of wind through waving stalks at harvest. In that moment, his senses seemed to reach beyond the wooden frame of the bakery, recalling golden fields in summer, the undertones of grass, hay, and earth. Yet here, in the lamplit quiet, the grain was already changing destiny. With steady fingers, he scooped handfuls of milled wheat from the sack's depth. Each handful felt cool, granular, 1,000 tiny spheres slipping through his grasp. He let them fall back, watching the slight dust cloud drift upward toward the lantern flames. Tiny motes sparkled like spindrift in slow motion, suspended in the warm light. He straightened the burlap, tugging it closed with a practiced tug, sealing away the bulk of the grain. These few handfuls would begin the baker's ritual, but the rest waited patiently for when the hearth reached precise readiness. At the next station lay a fine mesh sieve, its thin metal wires woven as tightly as lace. The baker held it aloft, inspecting its edge for any bent strand. In this early hour, no flaw could be overlooked. He poured the flour into the sieve, letting the faint racket of grain striking wire join the soft symphony of battering bellows and distant dripping from the eaves. With a slow, rhythmic motion, he tapped the sieve's rim with the back of his hand. White granules showered down, fine and light, settling into an unbroken mound on the oak countertop. The surface of the mound was smooth as sea glass, yet as he ran his palm across it, a ghost of friction remained. He felt the promise of pliability, of dough that would take shape under his hands. He paused and observed the drifting cloud of finer dust that rose from the tray. It hovered momentarily in the lantern-tinged air, a reminder of centuries of bakers who preceded him. If one listened closely, he imagined he could hear faint echoes of distant laughter from village bakehouses, the clink of clay crocks in monastic kitchens, the hushed murmur of early markets. All these whispers were woven into the very act of sifting, to purify, to refine, to prepare the flour for transformation. When the last handful passed through, he tapped the sieve one final time, then set it down with care, cleaning its edge and wiping away stray specks. Beside the flour lay a gleaming brass scale. 2 shallow pans swung from either side of a central beam, counterweights hanging like tiny moons. The baker picked up a small paper packet containing sea salt, its grains pale and irregular. He measured precisely the heft required, no more, no less. The salt grains clung together as he scattered them on one side of the scale, watching the beam settle into perfect balance. Then he repeated the measure for sugar, its tiny crystals shining like frost, and placed them into the opposite pan. A fraction too much, and the loaf would darken too quickly, too little, and the crust would lose its gentle bite. He adjusted the weights with a surgeon's precision. Next came the yeast, dried granules packed carefully into small jars. They resembled dusty amber shards, fragile and yet teeming with life unseen. He opened a metal tin, cupped a measured spoonful, and let the yeast grains roll across the scale. The beam dipped, then rose, until he found the precise threshold. He smiled, almost imperceptibly, at the tiny miracle held in those granules, the power to lift heavy dough into airy maturity. The baker placed each measured ingredient into waiting bowls, salt, sugar, yeast, like offerings in a quiet rite. The bowls sat in patient anticipation on the wooden board, ready for the water to join them. A soft breeze stirred at the window's edge, though the shutters remained closed. The baker paused in his work, turning his face toward the motion. The aroma of the night's rain on cobblestones drifted in faintly, reminding him that Paris, though still sleeping, was alive beyond these walls. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled once, then twice, each note lingering in the dawn air. The rhythm echoed inside him, marking the passage from preparation to creation. Returning to his station, he reached for a copper kettle of warmed spring water. Even at this early hour, the temperature was crucial, neither too hot to kill the yeast, nor too cold to slow the alchemy. He poured the water slowly into the wooden trough, watching fine rivulets snake among the bowls of dry ingredients. A hush fell as the grains of yeast and salt floated briefly, then sank, as though greeting an old friend. He took up a long-handled paddle, its surface worn smooth by years of stirring. With gentle arcs, he guided the paddle through the shallow pool, coaxing the ingredients together. Fine clouds of flour rose again, but now danced upon the water's surface, merging into a single, pale continuum. All at once, he felt the moment deepen, the hearth's warmth, the lantern's steady glow, the hushed symphony of measured ingredients. In that luminous stillness, the foundation of the day's bread was laid. He set aside the paddle and took a final glance at his workbench. The sacks of grain rested in their corner, full and awaiting later use, the sieve stood cleaned and silent, the scale glinted in the lantern light. What remained was the simple, enduring promise of dough to come. Beyond these walls, Chapter 5 would soon begin, when flour, water, yeast, and salt would transform into a pliable mass, the alchemy of bread-making in motion. But for now, in this chapter of lantern light and sacks of grain, the baker paused to honor the essence of his craft, the slow, meticulous inspection of raw materials, the measured blending of elements, the quiet ritual that ensured each loaf carried within it the legacy of artisans who had baked before him. The city may still slumber, but within this amber-lit sanctuary, life was stirring, grain by grain, breath by breath, toward the dawn. A hush deepens the bakery as the hearth's glow settles into a gentle warmth. The baker, his hands still faintly glowing from the fire's radiance, steps toward a heavy wooden trough. Lantern light pools across its surface, illuminating the folds and grain of the aged oak. He pauses, inhaling the mingled aromas of wood smoke and faintly toasting flour from yesterday's residual dust. In this moment, between fire and flour, between quiet dawn and busy morning, the baker prepares to conduct the first alchemy of his day, the marrying of water, yeast, salt, and wheat into living dough. He reaches for the sacks of milled wheat lining the wall, each one bearing the faint imprint of the miller's seal. The burlap feels coarse beneath his fingertips, and a small cloud of fine white dust flutters into the lantern's glow. With deliberate care, he tugs open a sack and allows a measured portion to spill onto the flat surface of the trough. The granules shift and settle, forming a small mound at the center. He taps the side of the sack twice, coaxing every stray grain free, then folds the burlap closed, setting it aside to wait its next turn. Fingers poised, he begins to fashion a well in that snowdrift of meal. He presses inward at 4 points around the mound, his hands forming a shallow crater that widens into a perfect circular pit. The rim of flour stands proud, a tiny fortress ready to contain the liquid that will soon awaken the mixture's spirit. This hollow, he knows, shapes the flow of water, yeast, and salt, commanding how they will meet and mingle in slow, purposeful convergence. A small copper pitcher stands ready, its surface dulled by the steady patina of years. Cradling it in one gloved hand, he tilts the spout toward the well. From a nearby urn, water drawn from the Seine's tributary has rested overnight, allowing the sediments to settle and the chill to temper. As he pours, the water glitters in the lantern's beam, each drop fracturing into a gentle ripple at the base of the flour walls. He controls the stream with measured patience, never too swift, never too dainty, ensuring the liquid remains at the heart of the mound until the grains of flour begin to cling. While water flows, the baker hefts a wooden paddle, its shaft long enough to reach every corner of the trough without risking a sooty hand. When the last gleam of the liquid settles in the hollow, he dips the paddle's flattened blade into the center, coaxing that first ribbon of wetted flour outward to the rim. The movement is slow and methodical, each sweep drawing the dry edges inward. Minute flour dust rises like morning mist, dancing around the paddle's lip before settling once more on the trough's smooth wood. Next comes the yeast, wild and gentle. In a small ceramic bowl, the baker has measured a modest heap of active strands, proofed in a bit of warmed water until they bubbled softly at the surface. He lifts the bowl, the slight tremor of brewing life evident in every delicate bubble. Tipping it into the well, he watches as the creamy liquid slides into the flour embrace. Almost immediately, tiny pockets form where yeast and water unite, as though the mixture desires to inhale breath. He pauses to observe, to respect the first stirrings of fermentation that promise rise and texture. A pinch of salt follows, sifted through slender fingers to fall like a fine winter rain across the uneven plain of dough. It disperses in small fireworks of crystalline sparkles before vanishing beneath the paddle's next brush. The baker steams a fingerdip and traces a small cross at the dough's center, a sign of blessing and protection passed down from his mentor. This ancient ritual, carried through countless mornings, reminds him that bread is not mere sustenance but a living heirloom of tradition. With ingredients united, the paddle becomes a lever of transformation. He begins to fold the edges of the flour inward, pressing the rim toward the center in a series of deliberate tucks. Each turn requires attention. If he rushes, the seams tear and the dough stiffens. If he hesitates, pockets of dryness persist and the internal crumb will prove uneven. So he moves with a pace neither hurried nor lazy, balancing firmness with gentleness in a dance his hands know by heart. As the mixture thickens and the paddle blade becomes encased in tacky mass, the baker transfers his efforts to his forearms and palms. Rolling up his sleeves, he plunges in. The cool, damp dough yields under pressure, stretching and folding in layers of gluten that bind flour and liquid into an elastic whole. He kneads in circular motions, pushing outward then folding back, pressing and turning until no dry streaks remain. Each motion draws out the dough's strength, waking the network of proteins that will hold air and shape through the baking. He feels the dough's transformation beneath his palms, from loose and powdery to soft and responsive. In this quiet communion, he senses the fiery ember of life shifting somewhere deeper. Tiny bubbles rise to the surface, trapped by the continuous push and fold, promising a lightness to come. His shirt faintly dampens from the dough's cool moisture, and the rhythmic creak of the trough accompanies the steady thrum of his breath. After several minutes, in some ways an instant, in others an eternity, the dough forms a single, smooth mass. The baker gathers it with both hands, tucking its edges neatly underneath to shape a rough spheroid. He sprinkles a fine dusting of flour across its surface, ensuring no part clings to the trough. Then, with a practiced flick of the wrists, he releases the ball onto the worktable. It rests there, proud and complete, awaiting its next passage. Before covering, the baker steadies himself to admire the result of this first act. The dough stands in modest dignity, a pale orb beneath the lantern's glow, its skin taut with inner purpose. In its simple form lie the grains of 1,000 fields, the trickle of river water, the patient efforts of hands centuries trained. He lays a clean linen cloth over the bowl that cradles the dough and folds its edges inwards like a protective shroud, guarding the precious ferment within. Stepping back, he lights a dimmer lamp by the hearth to maintain a gentle warmth. The room's shadows lengthen and soften, embracing the trough and tools in a hush that feels almost reverent. Outside, the sky shows the first faint hints of rose, though still veiled in pre-dawn gray. Inside, the baker allows a moment of quiet reflection before the next stage, the patient rest when the alchemy of yeast and grain will truly begin to sing. In this stillness, he recalls the moons and mornings past, each marked by the same rituals and rhythms. Yet no two doughs are identical, each demands its own accord of water, its own balance of pressure, its own breath of time. And so, as Chapter 5 closes on the birth of the day's first dough, the baker steps back into his role as custodian of small miracles yet to unfold, each loaf a testament to calm devotion, to the slow and steady pulse of a 19th-century Parisian dawn. A hush settles over the bakery once the first vigorous work of combining flour, water, yeast, and salt has concluded. The baker, shoulders releasing tension acquired during the rhythmic folds and turns of the dough, pauses to honor this pivotal moment of transformation. In the stillness that follows the alchemy of Chapter 5, a quiet ritual begins, one of patient observation, measured warmth, and the slow awakening of life within a simple mass of dough. Here, at the margin between craft and nature, every breath of air, every flicker of flame, and every subtle bulge in the dough's skin matters, for they speak to the living instincts of yeast and gluten intertwined. The baker's hands, dusted lightly with pale flour, reach for the linen cloth folded at the edge of the wooden trough. Its threads are softened by years of use, a faint pattern of lozenge weave visible under the glow of the lanterns. He drapes it carefully across the dough's surface, ensuring the edges tuck snugly against the sides of the trough. The cloth will guard against drafts that might chill the ingredients, yet allow the dough to breathe as it settles. Beneath it, the dough begins a silent expansion, a tender proofing that cannot be hurried. A low glow bathes the hearth, embers from the wood-fired oven smolder, overseen by slender brass tongs and a bellows resting on the hearth's edge. The baker stokes embers with a gentle breath, coaxing the dying heat into a steadier warmth. He adds a single seasoned log, oak, lightly charred, laying it carefully across the bed of coals. His motions are unhurried, guided by the knowledge passed down through centuries of Parisian bakers. Without a thermometer to dictate precise readings, he gauges temperature by sight and memory, the curl of flame, the hue of glowing charcoal, the whisper of heat on his fingertips. Every few moments, he glances toward the linen-draped trough. The bakery, once silent, hums now with intimations of life, the hush of wood cracking, the faint rustle of cloth as it relaxes over the dough, the soft hiss of steam escaping from the oven. In this interlude, the baker walks the space between hearth and table, each step measured. He lifts a small iron kettle, pours a dribble of well water into a shallow pan before the fire, and watches water bead and steam. The rising moisture in the air will further nurture the dough as it rests, preventing the crust from forming a dry barrier too soon. Time passes in unmarked increments, a quarter of an hour, perhaps more. The baker returns to the trough and, with the gentlest of touches, peels back the linen corner. Beneath, the dough reveals its first tiny bubbles, pale domes appearing at the seams, as if shy guests emerging at a soft gathering. These lentil-sized pockets promise airy crumb and the nuanced flavors of fermentation. He traces a fingertip along the surface, feeling the delicate elasticity that pulsates under his touch, a living network of gluten infused with carbon dioxide. Each bubble is a testament to the yeast's work, wild and cultivated, at once humble microbe and miracle. Quiet gratitude stirs in the baker's chest. He remembers the first chapters of this morning's journey, the cold water washed over his hands in the candlelight, the simple linen shirt donned with reverence, the solitary walk through moonlit streets of Paris. He recalls lifting the heavy door of the bakery and fanning the old hearth to life, the measurement of grains under lantern glow, the patient mixing of ingredients into the crouching mound of dough. Now, as dawn's edge begins to pale the horizon, he allows himself a moment to simply observe, to witness nature's slow incantation as the dough breathes and grows by imperceptible degrees. While the dough rests, the baker attends other tasks in a similarly measured fashion. He moves to the wooden workbench, where peels and boards will soon bear the weight of shaped loaves. With a soft cloth and a few drops of olive oil, he polishes the handles of each shovel, smoothing splintered wood and banishing any lingering sediment of yesterday's work. He arranges proofing baskets and lines them with fresh, flour-dusted linen. Although the dough will not be shaped yet, the order and readiness of these tools mirror the clarity in his own mind, a calm preparedness that honors the slow pace of fermentation. Beyond the hearth's warmth, the bakery's window shutters, thrown open at the first light of day, admit a faint breeze carrying distant sounds of awakening city life. A church bell tolls the hour, soft, pregnant notes that drift across the slate rooftops. Bakers from neighboring boulangeries draw their curtains, metal wheels of delivery carts clatter on cobbles, and somewhere a lamplighter performs his rounds. Yet here, within these thick stone walls and timber rafters, the world seems suspended, held between ember and bubble, between minute shifts in temperature and the gentle proof of dough. At moments like this, the baker often cradles a cup of weak herbal infusion, chamomile or verbena steeped overnight, to savor its soothing warmth. He lifts the cup to his lips and inhales the aroma, letting his senses recalibrate. The earthy notes of the brew mingle with the faint tang of fermenting dough and the mellow scent of burning oak. He closes his eyes briefly, picturing himself a custodian of processes older than memory. He is neither rushing toward the next task nor dwelling on the toil already done, he is simply here, present at the hinge of time. Slowly, the linen cover begins to billow as the dough's surface swells. The baker leans forward to study the pattern of bubbles more closely. Some have coalesced into clusters, forming miniature landscapes of convex domes. Others remain solitary, each a promise of soft crumb and delicate crust. He resists the urge to prod the dough further, knowing that only so many hands can guide its destiny, beyond that lies the domain of patience and observation. He straightens and turns to the hearth once more, tending the embers so that a gentle, even heat pervades the room. With the hearth balanced between smolder and flame, the air feels suffused with the promise of rising dough and dawn. The baker straightens his posture and takes a steadying breath, aligning mind and muscle with the unhurried symphony around him. He acknowledges that this interval, neither mixing nor shaping nor scoring, is as vital as any other. For it is here, in the subtle battle between cold and warmth, between salt's restraint and yeast's ambition, that the essence of bread is forged. As the clock's bell rings again, signaling that half an hour or more has slipped by, the baker gently tucks the linen back into place. He smiles at the small miracle beneath. Tomorrow's customers will taste the result, a crumb open yet resilient, a crust thin and fragrant, the texture and flavor imbued with notes of toasty grains and the faintest tang of fermentation. But for now, in this quiet chamber of hearth and trough, he rests too, a keeper of time, trusted to watch and wait. This chapter of patience draws naturally toward the next, shaping the dough into loaves that will soon traverse the same arc of proof and heat. When the moment arrives, he will lift each rounded piece from its resting place, coax it with gentle folds into its final form, and send it toward transformation once more. But until then, he lingers in the gentle lull, mindful that the slow, unassuming rise of dough beneath a humble cloth is a ritual as profound as any flare of flame or final flourish of scoring. Here lies the heart of his craft, the art of waiting, the grace of observation, and the attentive tending of living ingredients that will become bread at dawn. The long hour of dough's quiet fermentation ushers in a moment of stillness, one in which the master baker turns his attention away from the living mass of pale, gently rising sustenance and directs his focus instead toward the implements of his craft. In the soft glow of lantern light, the bakery's air is thick with the heady scent of wheat and wood smoke, yet there is a calmness here, a pause in the day's unfolding ritual. It is a time for care and precision, for preparing every surface, every instrument, so that when the dough emerges renewed from its rest, all is exactly as it must be. In the hush that fills the space between hearth and workbench, the baker stands before his wooden peels, those slender paddles of warm oak that will bear the shaped loaves into the oven's embrace, and he begins the practice of cleaning and oiling. He reaches first for a coarse linen cloth, worn soft by years of use, and gently wipes the face of the nearest peel. The motion is slow and deliberate, a stroke that travels the length of the blade, lifting away any lingering particles of flour or stray bits of dough from yesterday's batch. Underneath, the wood glows with its own deep grain, revealing ribbons of amber and honey that tell of the tree from which it came. This is not a hurried gesture, but a reverent one. The peel is both tool and extension of hand, an instrument whose smoothness must be coaxed into readiness. Once the surface feels clean, the baker lays the peel flat upon a low stool and uncorks a small vial of nut oil, a pale, fragrant liquid reserved for such occasions. With a second cloth, he applies a thin, even layer of oil across the timber, rubbing until the material drinks it in. The scent of toasted hazelnut drifts faintly to his nose as the wood darkens, nourished by the gentle balm. He performs this ritual again and again, peel by peel, slowly and methodically, until every board in the rack gleams with a soft sheen. From the row of peels he turns to the broad kneading table, its surface carved from solid walnut and speckled with the memory of countless batches. He lifts a small whisk broom, its bristles stiff and fine, and sweeps away the errant ridges of dried dough clinging to the edges. Each sweep arcs in an elegant curve, depositing ash and debris into the leather-bound crumb tray at the table's foot. When the surface lies clean, he produces a clean linen tea towel, fluffs it open, and begins to dust the bench with bagfuls of white flour. He pinches the soft powder between thumb and forefinger, allowing it to fall in a light cascade until the wood is cloaked in a fine, even veil. In the candlelight, the particles catch and star like motes on a breeze. He pauses, hand upon hip, surveying the work, satisfied that the stage is set for dough to be turned, folded, coaxed into shape. Nearby lie the proofing baskets, Bedtimes fashioned of wicker, spiraling inward like the rings of a great bowl, and the soft cloths that will line them. He lifts each bowl to eye level, inspecting the weave for stray splinters or threads. With careful fingers, he adjusts the cloths, smoothing their surfaces until no wrinkle mars the soft, flour-dusted fibers. He arranges them in neat rows upon a shelf beside a low window, where the first rays of dawn might filter in. Beneath each basket, he places a small wooden block, so that the vessels rest at a slight incline, encouraging any residual moisture to gather at one side without pooling. In perfect symmetry, the baskets stand poised to receive the loaves that will be shaped in the next hour. Throughout this quiet interlude, the baker's thoughts drift to the lineage of his labor. Each tool holds a story. The peels arrived from a workshop on Rue de Rosiers, where a woodcarver's hands labored to fashion them to the precise dimensions the master had requested. The Bedtimes journeyed from Alsace, whispered into form by a basketmaker whose family line traced back to Germanic traditions of bread-making. Even the brass scales and the humming bellows, which rest a pace away in a corner, bear the marks of artisans whose understanding of metal and would match this baker's faith in fermentation. As he cares for these objects, oiling and dusting, he feels connected to the vast continuum of hands that have shaped, fed, and sustained humankind. The air in the bakery remains cool, save for the warmth radiating from the hearth where embers still glow beneath a bed of ash. The baker stokes the fire once more, coaxing a faint, steady heat to rise. He stands for a moment before it, running the flat of his palm at a distance, gauging how the warmth will play upon the underside of the loaves when they slide into the oven. In this single breath, he balances the heat's memory in his mind with the practical knowledge of countless mornings. This hearth, like the tools, must be tended with care. Too fierce and the crust will blacken before the crumb ripens, too tame and the loaves will languish, pale and heavy. He feels its pulse and nods, content that the very heart of the bakery beats with measured consistency. As the lantern's flame flickers low, the baker returns to the workbench. Out of a small chest he withdraws his sharpest bench knife, the blade slender as a shard of moonlight and honed to an edge that sings when it parts the air. He slices a test hair, not from himself, but from the stray tuft of cloth clinging to a ragged cloth, just to sense the precision of the blade. It parts the tiny fiber in two without effort, a whisper of steel against cloth. He smiles slightly and, with deliberate strokes, wipes the knife clean, returning it to its leather sheath. This instrument, too, must be immaculate, its cut will define the loave's final shape and pattern. He steps back, surveying the now ordered room. Every tool rests in its appointed place. The peels stand ready at the rail, the board is dusted and clean, the Bedtimes wait patiently, the knife, and a small vessel of scalded water for steam, lie side by side, prepared for the baker's hand. In the hush, the walls themselves seem to breathe, anticipating the next movement of dough, the alchemy that follows rest and preparation. The light shifts imperceptibly as the waning oil lamp slips toward its final half hour, and the air grows a shade cooler, still more hushed. Outside, the first thin line of pale gray traces the horizon, promising the gentle arrival of dawn. Within the confines of this small, wood-paneled shop, every detail has been attended to, the texture of the wood, the angle of the baskets, the sheen of oil on timber, the fine dust of flour upon the bench. All have been shaped to guide the dough in its transformation from formless mass to graceful loaf. By tending to tools and space with equal devotion, the baker lays the groundwork for the next phase of his craft. When at last he returns to the trough where the dough rests, he will do so with hands that have been cleansed by steam and cloth, with a mind tuned to precision, and with implements that stand at the ready. The stage is set, and in the stillness before activity resumes, he finds a moment of quiet gratitude. In this space, time itself seems to slow, each breath, each gesture, each heartbeat measured against the ancient rhythm of baking. And thus, with tools sharpened, oiled, and placed, the baker awaits the hour when the resting dough will beckon him once more to shape, to score, and to send forth the first loaves of the morning. The lantern's glow had softened further by the time the baker returned to his workbench. The air in the bakery, now gently warmed by the hearth, carried the faint tang of fermenting dough. Each loaf that lay under its linen paws had developed a supple skin, dotted with tiny bubbles that spoke of hours of quiet transformation. In this hushed chamber, the master baker moved with deliberate grace, as though each gesture were part of a centuries-old rite. Here, in these early hours, the shaping of dough was not merely a step in a recipe but an act of reverence, a way of bringing forth the living heritage of Parisian bread. He unclasped the brass scale, its two shallow pans gleaming against the muted backdrop of stone walls. On the workbench, a fine dusting of wheat flour traced the outlines of baskets and boards. He lifted the first resting mass of dough, still warm, yielding softly to the hand, and placed it upon the scale. His fingers adjusted small iron weights with patient precision. 20 ounces, exactly. With a swift flick of the bench scraper, he severed this portion cleanly. The smooth, gliding sound of blade meeting dough was almost musical. As he transferred the measured lump to a floured board, he repeated the process: weigh, cut, set aside. Each piece, 20 more, then 20 more, formed a row of identical globes. In an age where every loaf spoke the baker's individuality, uniformity was his quiet tribute to tradition. Each portion of dough, once free-rising and round, now awaited its destiny, to become either the rustic boule or the slender baguette, each shape a note in the symphony of the day's offerings. Rounding the boules required a gentle, coaxing touch. The baker dusted the board once more, then cupped a dough piece in both hands. Thumbs spread widely across the underside while fingers pressed and turned. There was a rhythm to it: press in, gather up, spin, until the dough felt taut as a drum. The surface smoothed beneath his palms, sealing air within and orienting the gluten into a rounded architecture. With each turn, he whispered blessings of crust and crumb, as though urging the loaf to embody the warmth of hearth and memory of village ovens long past. After forming the boule, he placed it, seam side down, into a banneton basket lined with a tea cloth dusted heavily in rice flour. The weave of the basket pressed gentle ridges into the loaf's skin, lending it a pattern of light and shadow that would bloom into a flower of crust when baked. He repeated this ritual, lining each vessel with care, until a neat constellation of dough rounds gleamed in the lantern light. Then the baker knelt before a second row of dough portions, each poised to become a baguette. He sprinkled a narrow cutting board with flour, enough to prevent sticking but not so much that it would dull the shine of the final crust. Taking one portion, he flattened it with fingertips to expel large air pockets, then folded the near edge toward the far, sealing it with a soft press of the wrist. He repeated this fold twice more, lengthening the piece like a scroll unrolling in slow motion. With the mass now elongated, he rested it 5 heartbeats, then placed it again on the board and, using the flat of his hand, rolled the dough away from him. A gentle push and pull, back and forth, coaxed it into the familiar pencil shape. He monitored its length and thickness, keen to achieve the slender profile that would bake into that delicate snap of crust surrounding an airy interior. When satisfied, he lifted the stick of dough and laid it seam side up in a linen-lined couche, folding the cloth between each form so they would not shift as they proofed. Throughout this shaping, the silence of the bakery deepened. The only interruptions were the whisper of cloth against dough, the soft scrape of steel on wood, and the faint murmur of the city waking beyond shuttered windows. In these moments, the baker felt himself connected to every artisan who had practiced these same movements in centuries past. There was continuity here, a chain of diligent hands stretching back to the earliest days of Paris's ovens. Occasionally, he paused to pat flour from a basket's rim or to dust his work surface anew. He straightened the brass scales and returned the bench scraper to its hook. He glanced at the wall clock, noting the slow passage of time. A single hour still remained before the first light would slant through the front window. Already, the dough's forms stood in patient rows, awaiting dawn's warmth to coax them into their final rise. With all shapes complete, the baker moved among them, inspecting each with a craftsman's eye. The boules boasted taut, domed caps, their seams sealed firmly beneath. The baguettes, lined in orderly fashion, promised the characteristic throaty crack at first bite. He gently brushed stray flour from a loaf's surface, as though unveiling a work of art. A tranquil pride settled in his chest. Here was the culmination of hours of work, the moment when raw ingredients had become something enduring and nourishing. As a final gesture, he extinguished the lantern at the far end of the bench, allowing the central lamp to cast a halo of light over the dough. He arranged the shaped loaves in neat rows to the side, ensuring they would rest undisturbed. Tomorrow's first customers would see nothing of these early hours, only the golden crust and welcoming aroma that drift from the open door. Yet the memory of this shaping, this slow molding of heritage, lingered in every crease of linen and grain of flour. He paused in the doorway, the lantern's glow at his back, contemplating the silent procession of loaves. In another hour, they would move to proofing baskets by the window, greeting the dawn with all the promise of a new day. But for now, in this resting moment between creation and completion, the baker drew a steady breath and let the calm wash over him. Each boule and baguette was more than bread, it was a vessel of history, shaped by hands that understood the quiet power of ritual and the gentle sanctity of dawn in a Parisian bakery. The first, paling edge of dawn hovered beyond the bakery's small window panes when the master baker turned his attention from the shaping board to the quiet company of the proofing baskets. In those moments between shaping and baking, a sacred pause unfolded, a breathing space in which time itself seemed to slow, and the soft promise of morning hovered in the air. He moved with deliberate calm, as though he carried a lantern of patience within his own chest, casting gentle light onto each carefully sculpted loaf. Across the workbench lay 3 linen tea towels, each neatly pressed and dusted with a powder of mill-fresh flour. He laid them out one by one into the woven depths of the bain tuns, the round and oval baskets made of rattan cane. Fingers brushing the fabric, he whispered small thoughts of reassurance into the folds. Nobody would hear the words, but he believed they nourished the dough almost as much as the flour and water. The cloth settled into place, veils of pale white, ready to guard the loaves through their final rest. In the hush, the baker lifted the first boule, its smooth, taut surface quivering ever so slightly with the promise of rising. He had shaped it that moment before, pressed and rotated in his hands until a smooth sphere emerged, the seams tucked serenely at its base. He cradled the dough as though it were a fragile bird's egg, brushed a trailing smear of flour across its rounded crown, and laid it seam side up into the basket. The curve of the wood and the basket's spiral lines embraced the loaf as naturally as a mother would her child, providing a gentle cradle for the final ferment. He moved to the next, a slender baguette that lay coiled upon the board in rippled elegance. Dusting its length with flour, he lifted it gingerly, guiding the stem end into the elongated banneton. It settled against the basket's ribs, arms open just so to support its shape. There was artistry in this placement, the slender form needed room to expand without bursting, and so he angled it ever so slightly toward the basket's tilt, allowing gravity's quiet pull and the yeast's tireless work to collaborate in creating that gleaming, golden crust to come. Outside, the eastern sky had begun to soften from ink to a subdued periwinkle. Lanterns still glowed within the bakery, their flames casting lancing rays across the wooden floor. The baker paused, taking a slow breath to drink in the scent of proofing dough mingled with the remnants of smoldering wood ash. It was a heady perfume, warm, faintly sour, alive with promise. In these delicate minutes before the first rooster's crow, he pressed a hand to his own stomach, as though listening for the echo of fermentation inside himself. Each basket was covered with a spare linen cloth, carefully drawn over the rims and tucked beneath, like swaddling a newborn. These wrappings would guard the dough against unwelcome drafts, ensure that any tremors of air would not disturb the tender networks of gluten weaving themselves within. He arranged them side by side on a shelf built low to the floor, where the radiant heat of the hearth would caress them evenly without scorching or drying their surfaces. He paused again at the shelf's edge, leaning in close to note the slightest hint of movement. There, beneath the pale cover, he imagined the loaves swelling gently, cell by cell, minute by minute, as the yeast released its tiny murmurs of gas. He recalled Chapter 6, when the first dough rested in the wooden trough, and how those embryonic bubbles had first surfaced, timid as dewdrops. Now, weeks of practice and years of ritual had brought him here, to the final crescendo of proof. He felt a quiet gratitude for time itself, which ripened the simplest mixture into something miraculous. A distant church bell told the half-hour past 4. Its sonorous note drifted through half-open shutters, reminding the baker that Paris was stirring. In the courtyard beyond the bakery door, he could just perceive the steady clip-clop of a horse's hoof, a rasp of carriage wheels against the cobblestones. Soon, a warm gust of air would push through the tall windows, laden with the aroma of chestnut blossoms and early market stalls setting up for the day. But for now, he lingered in the sacred calm of proof. His eyes drifted back to the baskets. Light had shifted once more, the lavender wash of sky deepened to pale rose along the horizon. He thought of the next steps that lay ahead, scoring each loaf with his razor-sharp lame, coaxing symbols of his signature into the crust. He might recall Chapter 7, when he had coined shapes with peels and boards ready, or Chapter 8, when each portion of dough had felt so malleable under his palms. All those labors now converged here. And yet, nothing in this moment could be rushed. Nature's pace was the only rhythm that mattered. He moved across the bakery, pausing to draw fresh logs from the woodpile. Gently, he fed the hearth a single block at its flank, not to rekindle a blazing flame but to sustain a golden cradle of heat. The hearth crackled softly, like a lullaby for bread, sending a wisp of smoke curled up the chimney. He adjusted the clay stopper ever so slightly, ensuring the oven held just enough warmth to envelop, but not restrict, the proofing baskets. The chimney sang a muffled note in response, as though agreeing to be a silent guardian of the loaves. The baker allowed himself a moment of reflection. Here, amid the scent of sourdough and warming hearthstone, he found an unspoken connection to those who had baked before him. In centuries past, they too had lined their baskets, tuned their ovens, and watched the loaves' gentle breathing. He considered the generations of craftsmen whose hands had shaped Paris's bread heritage, who in turn nourished the city's poets, soldiers, artists, and laborers. It was a lineage borne forward in flour and water, in heat and patience. Above him, pigeons cooed on the rooftop, fluttering as the light brightened. The baker straightened, smoothing a stray belt of flour from his apron. He checked the time by the sundial etched faintly on the workshop's south wall. Nearly an hour remained before he would slide these loaves into the oven's embrace. For now, he treasured the hush. The gentle dawn rituals of a 19th-century Parisian bakery were alive in every heartbeat of the room, and he stood at the center with an abiding serenity. When the moment finally arrived, he would lift each basket, turn the loaves out onto his wooden peel, and score the skins with deft strokes. But until then, he listened. He listened to the subtle swell of proofing dough. To the sigh of coals in the hearth. To the soft awakening of a city about to greet another day. And in the quiet, he found the perfect calm he needed, proofing as dawn broke. In the soft hush just before the oven's roar, the bakery still holds the breath of anticipation. Dawn's palest glow, filtered faintly through the tall windows, cast slender rectangles of light across the flour-dusted board. The loaves rest in their linen-lined bain tuns, their proud, rounded forms gleaming with a gentle sheen of condensation. The master baker steps forward, his heart steady and his mind calm, ready for the moment that transforms mere dough into a living emblem of his craft. He pulls from the high shelf a shallow tin tray, its edges worn smooth by decades of use. A small mound of finely milled flour lies like freshly fallen snow within the tray's confines. He lifts the first loaf, transferring it from its cloth cradle with reverent hands. The dough yields just enough beneath his touch, firm, yet airy, pliant yet holding its shape. Gently, he inverts the ban eaten over the tray, and the loaf lands softly on the flour bed. A light dusting rises, ephemeral clouds of white that settle on the crust in a delicate veneer. The baker repeats this ritual with each round and slender form, boules and baguettes alike, until every piece bears a light kiss of flour, a gift as much to the eye as to the oven. Around him, time seems to slow. He pauses between loaves, allowing the moment to breathe. The bakery's familiar scents, warm wheat, a hint of sourness from fermentation, circulate in the still air. Above, the hearth's embers glow faintly, as if awaiting the signal to burst into flame. Yet for now, they remain quiet, honoring this precise, silent rite. With the tray emptied, he places it aside and reaches for his blade. The lame, slender, and almost fragile in appearance, is the baker's signature implement. Its razor-sharp edge is mounted upon a slender wooden handle, gripped in the workshop by countless generations of bakers before him. To wield the lame is to call upon the craft's purest tradition, to etch the baker's mark, his very name, in crust and crumb. He selects the first loaf, a boule of modest size, its dome rising like the gentle arch of a cathedral's vault. He holds the lame at a low angle, poised at the perfect slant to guide the blade across the surface. His hand is steady, practiced. In one swift motion, he draws the blade, a single slash, shallow yet confident, carving a crescent-shaped score that will bloom open with proud expansion in the heat. The cut reveals a sliver of pale interior beneath the dusted crust. A rising curve, like the bow of a small boat, drawn free across the dough. The baker inspects the incision, nodding ever so slightly. The curve runs clean and even, neither too deep nor too light, guiding the loaf's rise so that it may swell upward rather than split in wild, tearing fissures. Each cut is an exercise in measured control, enough to let steam escape, enough to sculpt the final shape, enough to declare the baker's own artistry. He moves to the next loaf, a longer, slender form destined to become a crusty batard. He positions the lame near one end, angles it just so, and slices with deliberate grace. The blade slices through the surface with no more resistance than swiping a quill through vellum. A curved line appears, almost like a soft crescent moon hovering above the dough's pale expanse. Again, he studies the line, marveling at how the simple slash will yield such drama once the hearth's heat breathes life into it. Between cuts, he adjusts the light from a single lantern stationed close by, its gentle flame casting a warm glow that enhances every ridge of the dough, the slightest high point now illuminated, every valley tinted in soft shadow. He steps back, his gaze sweeping across the board where loaves lie scored and waiting. The scene unfolds like a gallery of white sculptures, each bearing a distinctive mark, a cross, a crescent, parallel lines, or an abstract flourish. No two are identical, yet each is bound by the same language of curve and depth. For the more ornate patterns, the baker allows himself a brief moment of silent reflection. He envisions the final loaf, emerging from the flames at just the right moment, the crust split along each groove, creating petals or rays, a burst of petals swirling outward. These patterns are not superfluous decoration, but a practical script that guides the loaf's expansion. Even so, there is an artistry to their design, an unspoken signature, a personal flourish that speaks of years of dedication and quiet pride. He attends to a larger boule, nearly the size of a man's two fists pressed together. The thick mass of dough tempts a heavier hand, but the baker restrains himself, knowing that for a loaf of this girth, a more measured cut is wise. He bends low, placing the lame at the precise axis, and with a swift pull creates a deep cross, two intersecting lines that will open wide like the arms of a welcoming cathedral doorway. He lingers only long enough to ensure each arm of the cross is crisp and true, then draws back. In the hush that follows, the only sound is the faint hiss of flour settling, drifting through the air in tiny motes before settling again. The baker closes his eyes for an instant, feeling the hush settle around him. Outside, a single church bell tolls the hour, its resonant peal carried through the open door. He breathes in, steeped in the moment, fully present, and then the task continues. Loaf by loaf, he works his way down the row, slender baguettes receive a series of short, rhythmic slashes, small batards bear elongated, graceful cuts, ovoid batards have an elegant fishbone pattern cut down their spines. With each motion, his arm arcs smoothly, his wrist precise. The blade never hesitates, and in the placement of each cut, he reveals the care with which the dough was shaped earlier, each fold, each turn of gluten strands now translated into lines of potential energy that will unfurl in the oven. When the last loaf is scored, he sets the lame aside and surveys his handiwork. The scores lie stark and bright against the pale surfaces, each telling its own story. Some will crack wide, exposing the shining crumb beneath, others will whisper open, their crusts fringing like petals in bloom. The board holds a silent promise: these loaves will rise further, their shapes perfected by the baker's guiding hand, their textures forming in response to the precise slashes made in this quiet moment. With calm satisfaction, he lifts each loaf onto a slender wooden peel, careful to support them as they travel from the board to the oven's threshold. The lines of blade and the murmur of dough have been laid, soon, the fire will transform them. Yet before that final step, he allows himself a brief pause. He runs a fingertip lightly along one score, feeling the neatly formed line beneath his touch, and a faint smile curves his lips. This is the baker's mark, a moment of unity between man, dough, and flame. Outside, the dawn light brightens. The city stirs. In a half-hour's time, the hearth will be ablaze, and the scored loaves will slip within to begin their final metamorphosis. But for now, in this narrow interval, the bakery holds only the hush of dawn and the perfect geometry of freshly scored dough. And so the baker straightens the tray of loaves, aligning them precisely at the edge of the peel. The next breath he takes will be drawn in the warmth of the oven, the next instant he will witness his signature patterns bloom into crackling crusts. But that moment lies a heartbeat away. For the present, there is only the calm assurance of preparation complete, the hushed reverence of craft upheld, and the soft, lingering grace of dawn just before the oven's fire is called to life. The first light of dawn was still a pale suggestion when the master baker turned from his workbench, where scored loaves lay in neat rows, ready, at last, to meet the fire. The bakery's great hearth glowed faintly, its embers stirred to life by patient tending through the night. In the soft lantern glow, the baker paused, his hand resting on the polished handle of the wooden peel. He inhaled deeply, savoring the mingled scent of flour and yeast that had ripened in the proving baskets and now brimmed with promise. Each loaf bore the signature curve of the baker's blade, tender gashes that would blossom into golden ears as the heat coaxed them open. He moved with deliberate care, as though performing a ritual as old as the city itself. The air held a gentle warmth, rising from the hearth, but the chill of the early hour lingered around him, furthered by the high vault of the baker's shop. He laid the peel against his forearm to steady it, and without haste slid its thin edge beneath a boule whose rounded belly had swelled overnight. The dough yielded softly, the cloth lining of the ban-eaten releasing it like a mother's hand. The baker straightened the handle, then turned his wrist in a smooth motion to transfer the loaf onto the flat, heated brick of the oven floor. A gentle hiss greeted the movement as a whisper of steam sighed from the crust, followed by a faint crackle, as if the bread itself exhaled in relief as it touched the warmth. A few breaths later, long slender baguettes followed the boules, each one sliding forward on the peel and away across the glowing surface until it came to rest beside its companions. The baker placed them with measured spacing, ensuring each loaf would have room to expand and blossom. His lantern, swung aside, cast dancing shadows on the curved interior of the hearth, where flames licked the stones and shadows flickered like breath in a cavern. Then, with a final step, he reached for a small clay stopper, its base tapered to fit snugly into the vent at the oven's throat. He pressed it gently into place, sealing the chamber so that the heat would hold and the steam, vital to crust development, would swirl within. From the threshold of the oven's arch, the baker listened. A symphony of crackles and gentle pops rose from the darkness, punctuating the hush of the early morning. Each pop marked a bubble of water vapor bursting through the surface of dough that was already transforming. Within, the yeast and gluten battled and danced, forging new textures and building an airy crumb beneath a rugged crust. Outside, the building stirred imperceptibly. Faint echoes drifted in, the creak of shutter hinges next door, the distant murmur of horse hooves on cobblestones, the low toll of a church bell calling the faithful to pre-dawn prayer. Yet here, in the warmth of the hearth, the baker existed in a moment removed from time, his entire attention fixed on the progress of those hidden shapes of rising light and sound. He stepped back, wiping his palms on the front of his linen apron, and reached for his brass-tipped hourglass. The sand within would measure the minutes, each grain falling like a soft promise of golden crust. He set the glass atop a low wooden stool beside the hearth, where it caught the glow and glinted. With that, he retreated to a nearby bench, his posture relaxed but alert. His eyes remained on the narrow slit of the oven door, through which he could sometimes glimpse a flicker of flame, a flash of steam escaping in a white plume before being drawn back inside. As the minutes passed, the oven matured into a living entity. The gentle burst of moisture gave way to the deeper crack of expanding crust, and the baker could almost sense the heat permeating the dough. He rose occasionally to refill the brazier with small pieces of seasoned beechwood, chosen for its consistent burn and fragrant smoke. Each added log settled into a soft glow before bursting into flame, maintaining the oven's heart at an even, nourishing warmth. He tossed a quick glance at the loaves still on the peel by the worktable, pain de campagne, enriched with a hint of malt, destined to enter the hearth soon. But he let them rest, for these first batch of boules and baguettes commanded his full attention. After the sand in the hourglass had fallen, he approached again. With a practiced hand he withdrew the clay stopper, releasing a delicate hiss of steam that curled upward in a ghostly wisp. The heat pressed against his face like a living thing. He grasped the peel, eased its blade beneath a boule, and with a slight lift coaxed it free. The crust cracked beneath his blade, and a hollow thud resonated as he tapped the bottom of the loaf, a sound he had committed to memory, one that signaled the perfect bake. He turned it over, setting it gently on a wooden rail fixed at the front of the hearth. The crust was deep amber, flecked with a russet patina where the flour had caught the heat. A thin plume of steam rose from a single fine gash, and the baker's lips curved in approval. He followed with another, and then the first baguette. The slender loaf gave its own sonorous echo, crisp and resonant. He lined the fresh loaves on a series of cooling racks that ran along the side wall, allowing the warm air to circulate freely. As they cooled, the crust set firm, and the aromas began to seep into the early morning air, the nutty scent of well-caramelized crusts, the gentle fragrance of wood smoke, the soft undertones of fermenting grain. Outside, the dawn brightened, pale gold light seeping through the bakery windows, but inside all remained hushed and reverent. The baker paused to clean his tools. He brushed stray flour from the hearth's threshold, wiped the peel and ladled fresh water into the brass basin by his elbow to dampen the oven floor, ensuring the next batch would begin with just the right quantity of moisture. He adjusted his coals and checked the thermometer, a slender iron rod he had forged himself, then stepped back once more to admire the transformed loaves glimmering in the glow of lanterns. Each one was a testament to hours of patient work, to the slow alchemy of flour, water, salt, and fire. In those final moments, the bakery, once dark, silent, and cold, stood alive with promise. The early customers, still rising in their homes, would soon catch the first notes of fresh bread in the breeze that drifted from the open doorway. But before those footsteps sounded, the master baker lingered, letting the warmth seep into his bones and the quiet satisfaction settle in his heart. The first fire had done its work. Now, with the hearth recharged, he turned to the next loaves at rest on the bench, ready to bring them forth into heat and light, carrying the gentle dawn rituals further into day. And so, with the crackle of embers and the soft glow of sunrise, Chapter 11 closed its quiet ceremony of flame and dough, opening the way for the sweeter scents and brighter bustle that lay ahead. In the dim haze of dawn, when the first pale streaks of light dance across the floorboards, the baker approaches the oven with a quiet reverence. The hearth's heavy iron door, still warm to the touch from the night's fire, opens with a faint, reluctant groan. Steam billows forth in wavering clouds, carrying the rich scent of browned crusts and caramelized sugars through the still air of the bakery. He pauses, blade of his wooden peel poised at the threshold between the oven's heart and the cool chamber beyond. Each loaf appears like a sleeping creature, its skin taut and rosy, scored patterns deep and alive with promise. Gently, he slides the first boule from its place upon the glowing floor. The weight of the loaf lies heavy in his hand, its underside crackling like autumn leaves beneath pressure. He balances it carefully on the lip of the peel, feeling its hardness yield ever so slightly to the wood. One by one, he draws each loaf free, oval batards, round boules, slender batons, rotating them as needed to ensure no corner remains unshrouded by the morning light. As each emerges, a soft chorus of exhalations rises from within the bread, symphonies of steam and aroma that greet the waking world beyond the oven's mouth. He transfers the fledgling loaves onto a long row of wooden cooling racks. The racks, simple structures of aged beechwood, slatted to promote air circulation, stand ready like silent witnesses. Each plank bears the faint indentations of his years of service, flecks of flour and darkened edges that speak of countless dawns witnessed in this very room. With measured care, he places each loaf into its appointed spot, ensuring a gentle distance between them so that no too hot crusts press too closely, risking dampness or an uneven crust. The racks fill slowly, one tier above the next, until the room seems to glow with the gentle radiance of fresh bread. Steam swirls in the spaces between shelves, forming halos of mist around every loaf. The baker steps back to observe, his face half lit by the lantern that still hangs overhead. In that quiet moment, he inhales deeply, letting the subtle dance of yeasty perfume and smoky warmth fill his lungs. It is a scent that carries memory, of wheat fields rippling in summer breeze, of long afternoons by the mill, of the patient hum of fermentation deep in a bowl of dough. Here, in this soft hush before the city stirs, the aroma holds him suspended between yesterday's labors and tomorrow's hopes. As the loaves rest, the baker moves to a small side table, where rests a coarse, linen-lined basket. In his hand, he carries a slender knife, its blade honed to a fine edge. He selects one crusty boule, still venting its final wisps of steam, and lays it upon a wooden cutting board. The knife glides in a swift, deliberate motion, slicing through the crust with minimal effort. He parts the loaf, exposing the crumb, a tapestry of honey-colored tunnels and delicate pockets, each bubble a testament to the long fermentation he coaxed from flour and water. He tilts the cut half toward the lantern's glow, scrutinizing the crumb's color, its moisture, its resilience. The interior is supple yet firm, with a sheen of warmth that speaks of perfect baking time. A slight tear near the center reveals the exact moment the dough surrendered to the heat. He nods to himself, satisfied, the loaf is worthy. He returns the halved boule to the shelf, cradling both pieces with care to avoid marring the golden crust. Though a morsel beckons him, soft crumb dusting his fingertips, he resists. The morning's work demands restraint, each test slice is a silent pledge to the bakers of old, an oath that every loaf set before the first customer must stand beyond reproach. With practiced rhythm, he wipes his blade on a rough linen cloth and steps back to the racks. A gentle breeze drifts through the half-open window, carrying with it the distant clatter of a delivery cart's wheels and the faint laughter of a street vendor arranging crates of produce. The mingling scents, fresh bread, dewy air, damp cobblestone, combine into an essence that could rouse even the heaviest sleeper. The baker allows himself a small smile as he envisions the faces of early risers, noses lifted to shutters just beginning to move, drawn by this subtle call. Now, with the loaves cool enough to handle fully, he begins the final phase of display. Along a polished wooden shelf recessing below the storefront window, he arranges each loaf with deliberate artistry. A slim baguette rests alongside a round pain de campagne, their shapes contrasting like a pair of old friends. He places the boule with the scored fleur-de-lis pattern in the center, its ornate slash marking the baker's signature. Next to it, he positions a crisp rye loaf, its dark skin dusted with bran, speckled like a twilight sky. He steps back and adjusts a roll slightly askew, ensuring that every edge aligns with the others in neat harmony. As he works, shafts of morning sun stretch across the counter, illuminating the dusting of flour on each crust. The rays catch in fleeting motes of residual steam, setting them aglow like tiny fireflies. A hush falls as if the bakery itself holds its breath, waiting for the moment when the front shutters will rise and reveal this tableau to the waking city. Throughout the slow ritual of arranging bread, the baker contemplates the connections between heat and rest, between sweat and reward. The hours he spent kneading and shaping now bloom into these quiet, steadfast loaves. He recalls the dough's first tender yielding, the countless folds that strengthened the strands of gluten, the careful tending of the fire that coaxed structure from the mixture of grain and yeast. Each step, though seemingly small, formed a link in an unbroken chain reaching back to the origins of baking itself. When the last loaf settles into place, the baker steps out into the street for a moment of reflection. The cobblestones beneath his boots glisten with early morning dew, and the day remains hushed aside from occasional echoes of distant footsteps. He breathes in the city's nascent stirrings, heart settled in a space of stillness that only this moment can offer. Behind him, through the wide-open door, the warm glow of the bakery frames the display shelf like a stage set aglow with golden harvest. Soon, the shutters will lift, and the doors will stand wide to welcome the first customers seeking the day's best bread. But for now, in these few precious minutes, the morning's work lies unclaimed, an offering of sight, scent, and substance waiting to begin its journey into the hands and homes of Paris. The baker lingers in that soft threshold, savoring the hush before the city exhales, secure in the knowledge that with these cooling racks and morning aromas, another day's ritual of gentle dawn is complete, and yet always, graciously, beginning again. A trembling hush lay over the Rue de Carmis as the master baker's weathered fingers found the iron ring at the top of the outer shutter. The sky, still a wash of paling slate, promised dawn but had not yet relinquished the last whispers of night. He paused, inhaling the faint aroma of charred embers long cooled, mingled with the subtle hint of flour dust that lingered in every corner of the simple shop. It was in this moment, between the darkness and the light, that the day truly began. With measured effort, he drew the shutters upward. The wrought iron chains rattled softly, a gentle herald that cut through the lingering stillness. A sliver of pale gold crept in, painting the worn threshold and illuminating motes of dust dancing above the wooden floorboards. Each panel rose in turn, revealing once more the narrow street outside where early risers and tradesmen would soon gather to claim the first of his loaves. He straightened the corners of his linen apron, its fabric still bearing the faint outline of yesterday's kneading. The baker ran a hand through his tousled hair, unaccustomed to haste, and allowed himself a moment's quiet satisfaction. There, on the simple shelf along the wall, sat the morning's offerings, boules with their domed crowns crackling down the middle from the daring slash of his lame, supple baguettes, slender and eager, their golden crusts glistening in the new light, a few slender batards, each with the tiniest puff of steam that had escaped overnight. A soft patter on the stone outside drew his attention. He leaned forward to peer through the open vestibule. Already, the blacksmith's broad silhouette was visible beneath the lamplight of a nearby gas lamp, an anvil's shape glinting faintly across his shoulder. The blacksmith, Monsieur Remy, had been one of his first patrons when the bakery opened 2 autumns past, and each dawn he arrived, sometimes earlier, to secure the day's first crust. In response, the baker offered a small nod, the gesture as familiar as the rising of the sun itself. "Monsieur," came the blacksmith's low voice, gravelly from cold air and early exertion. A small lantern swung from his hand, casting dancing shadows on the shop's threshold. "I trust the hearth treated you well." The baker gave a modest smile. "As well as one might hope," he replied, his voice hushed yet warm. "Your loaf is ready, as ordered." He reached behind the counter and lifted a boule, still faintly warm, placing it with reverence upon the wooden board. Monsieur Remy produced a handful of copper coins, each one stamped with the seal of Paris, and passed them across the counter. The exchange of metal against wood echoed softly in the now awoken room. As the baker received payment, he eased the boule into coarse brown paper, folding the edges with deliberate care to preserve the crust's fragile crispness. Then, with a practiced twist, he bound the paper with thin twine, forming a neat, parcelled loaf. With a final tug, he handed it to the blacksmith, who cradled it as though it were a living thing. "Merci, mon ami," murmured Monsieur Remy. He lifted his lantern high enough to catch the baker's face in its glow, eyes content. Then, with a gentle nod, he stepped back into the awakening street, leaving the bakery's doorway silent once again. The baker placed another bundle on the shelf and exhaled slowly, attuning himself to the rhythm of this quiet ritual. He reached to draw open the interior shutters, a far gentler movement than the rough clang of the exterior, and allowed a fuller beam of dawn to filter in. The shop became brighter, the grain-colored walls softening under the morning's light. Almost at once, a second figure appeared, the young baker from the boulangerie below, Monsieur Lefebvre, came climbing the narrow staircase two at a time. The apprentice-turned-colleague carried under one arm a cloth bundle whose contents released a sweet, yeasty aroma. He arrived in the shop with the innocent enthusiasm of youth, cheeks glowing from the cool air of the street. "Good morning, maître," he said, setting his bundle on the counter. "I thought you might like these." He opened the cloth to reveal a handful of freshly baked petits pains de lait, their pale crusts flecked with sugar granules that gleamed like dewdrops. The master baker's eyes softened. Though he preferred the elemental pleasures of crust and crumb, he took a small pain de lait with gratitude. He inhaled the tender sweetness before breaking off a corner to taste its light crumb. A quiet pleasure stirred within him as the sugar melted on his tongue. "You honor me," he said, dipping his head in acknowledgement. "They smell divine." Monsieur Lefebvre beamed, proud to contribute to the morning offerings. "I thought a small variation for today's early hours," he explained. "Something to temper the earthiness of the rye for those who seek a gentler start." The master baker nodded. He glanced at the shelf now adorned with an assortment of morning wonders, the sturdy boules, the slender baguettes, the creamy petits pains. All were neatly wrapped and ready to be lifted by the next wave of customers, milk carriers, laundresses with baskets perched on their hips, a few well-dressed ladies accompanied by long-haired coaches who paused for a loaf before the day's errands. Already, muffled footsteps approached. The baker straightened himself behind the counter, hands folded in front of his apron. He felt the familiar surge of anticipation, the slight flutter in his chest as the world beyond his oven pressed in, demanding that the magic of the night's labor be transformed into sustenance and solace for the waking city. The shutters at the front swung wider as a mother and her small child paused at the door. The child's eyes widened at the sight of warm bread, and the mother lifted her skirts to step inside. The mother pointed hesitantly to a warm boule, its crust so deeply golden that it almost glowed. The baker reached out, slipping on a linen glove to protect his palm, and lifted the loaf with still warm fingers. He wrapped it carefully in the brown paper, binding it with twine exactly as he had done for the blacksmith. "How much, monsieur?" asked the mother in a soft voice. 3 sous, replied the baker gently. He watched as the child's mother counted the coins, then accepted the parcel with a gracious nod. The child reached forward to touch the warm package, only to be guided by his mother's firm, loving hand. "Merci," she whispered, tucking the bread against her arm as she stepped back into the slowly brightening street. One by one, the early patrons filed in, each drawn by the promise of warmth and nourishment. The baker met each with the same calm attentiveness. He would select the loaf that suited their need, wrap it in paper, tie the twine, exchange coin for bread, and send them on their way. Outside, the shutters stood wide, a frame through which the baker beheld the cadence of Paris coming to life. With each sale, the shop filled a little more with the soft murmur of conversation, children's delight at shiny coins, the scrape of chairs as gentlemen paused to rest, the rustle of skirts as women adjusted their wraps against the morning chill. Through it all, the baker remained rooted behind his counter, the vigil of night's preparation giving way to the rhythm of communal ritual. At last, as the clock's single hand approached the hour when day would be in full swing, he stepped back from the counter and surveyed his domain. The shelf held a measured reserve of loaves for those who would come at midday, a second row of petits pains and brioches rested ready for those seeking sweetness. The lower rack displayed larger crusty batards destined for the family dinner tables, where the warmth of his hearth would echo across supper conversations. He exhaled, letting the sigh carry away the remnants of sleep. Beyond the open door, sunlight finally tipped the rooftops in rosy gold. Within the bakery, the scent of fresh bread lingered in every nook, a silent testament to hours of patient work. In the lingering quiet between the morning's first bustle and the impending rush of mid-morning, the master baker allowed himself a fleeting moment of reflection. So passed the opening ritual of the day, shutters drawn, first sales concluded, the sweet arc of dawn bridging solitude and communion. It was a timeless dance, performed each morning in countless boulangeries across the city, and yet each day felt reborn, as delicate and ephemeral as the crust on a loaf of warm bread. As the last early customer departed, leaving behind the gentle echo of footsteps on stone, the baker touched his forehead in a silent salute to the work yet to come. The shop was awake, its hearth thoroughly stoked by dawn's commerce, and already the next chapter of the day awaited, the soft sweetness of fruit tarts, the crisp lamination of croissants, the measured hush before the mid-morning lull. But for now, in the gentle afterglow of first light, the bakery stood as a simple haven, a quiet promise of sustenance and solace for all who passed through its open doors. A gentle light filters through the high windows of the bakery, painting the worn floorboards in pale gold as the day's first warmth slips into the cool interior. The early bustle of customers has already begun to ebb, and the baker stands for a moment by the wide wooden counter, his hands pressed lightly against its surface. Faint traces of flour and the soft indentations of crusty loaves remain from the morning rush, an echo of the simple joy that fresh bread brought to the neighborhood. Now, with the hearth still steady and the air fragrant with lingering warmth, he turns his attention to sweeter undertakings. Today, as every Sunday since he first opened this little shop on Rue des Martyrs, the focus shifts to delicate fruit tarts and choux pastries, petite éclairs waiting to emerge in crisp shells, and tartlets brimming with jam-kissed fruit. He begins, as he always does, by coaxing the fire to settle into a perfect, even heat. A pair of well-worn bellows finds its place once more against the embers. With patient, rhythmic puffs, the baker draws forth warmth until the hearth's interior glows a muted amber. Above it, a copper pot rests in readiness, its curved sides reflecting the dancing light. Into the pot he pours fresh, whole milk, nearly a quart drawn from the neighboring dairy farm that morning. The milk is cool and slightly sweet, flecked faintly with bits of cream that float in lazy currents. He measures carefully, as though each drop might alter the very nature of his choux pastry. A small chunk of butter, chilled in the early hour, joins the pool of milk, and almost at once it begins to melt, transforming from a snowy lump into a pool of glossy gold. He stirs gently with a wooden spoon, its handle darkened by years of use, until the milk and butter form a single harmonious warmth. A whisper of steam rises in thin tendrils, curling toward the low-beamed ceiling. Standing close enough to feel that gentle heat on his face, he closes his eyes for a heartbeat. There is a stillness here that does not exist anywhere else, the hush of dawn mingled with the quiet eddy of flour-dusted air, the creak of timber, and the distant chime of a neighboring parish bell. Next comes the precise moment of transformation, the heart of pot au choux. He lifts the pot from the fire and sets it carefully on a marble-topped table. The cool surface is a study in contrast, cold to the touch beneath his flour-dusted palms, and he knows that temperature is everything. When the mixture has reached the perfect pitch, hot enough to steam in soft swirls but scarcely bubbling at the edges, he stirs in a measured heap of sifted flour. The cloud of white rises beneath the wooden spoon, settling quickly as he works the paste with a steady hand. Gradually, the milk and flour unite in a single mass, pulling away from the sides of the pot in a tender, elastic ribbon. Returning the pot to the hearth, he draws the paste over gentle warmth, coaxing out any trace of raw starch. Stir, swirl, fold, the motions are as familiar as the stripes on his apron. When the dough forms a smooth shell around the spoon, he removes it once more and transfers it to a cool basin. There, he adds eggs one at a time, each incorporated until the dough has the right flow, thick enough to hold its shape, fluid enough to pipe without hesitation. All the while, he works in silence, his mind tracing the arc of tomorrow's light, the rhythm of flower-scented breezes drifting through open windows. At last, the moment arrives to transfer the choux dough into a piping bag. He fits the bag with a narrow, star-tipped nozzle and pauses, as though acknowledging the weight of the quiet morning. Then, with a sure hand, he guides the bag along a lightly floured pastry cloth. A small mound of dough emerges, no larger than an egg but destined to become an éclair or a pâte à choux puff. He spaces each dollop with care, leaving room for the pastry to breathe and puff in the heat of the oven. The repetition is almost meditative: pipe, steady, pipe, steady. White mounds in neat rows, each one waiting for the moment it will bloom in the oven's embrace. While the choux shells rest, he turns his thoughts to the tartlets. There is a simple joy in this work, a kind of domestic poetry. He gathers flour, sugar, a pinch of salt, and chilled cubes of butter from a small wooden caddy. A gentle rub between fingertips transforms the mixture into sandy crumbs. Then an egg yolk, veiled in a whisper of water, brings the dough together beneath his palms. He presses the short crust into pale discs, then rolls them thin as parchment on the floured table. Tiny, round tin molds await their tender linings. One by one, he presses the pastry into each mold, coaxing the crisp tart shells to form. Each indentation of his fingers is a farewell to imperfection. He smooths the edges, trims away excess, and returns the molds to a moment on ice, where the pastry can rest, firm and cool. A brief interval passes, spent attending to the hearth, dusting down the linen work cloth that lies near the door, and refilling the lantern's oil reservoir so that its pale flame will surely burn when the morning light wanes. The city beyond begins to stir more insistently now. A carriage rattles over cobblestones, a distant laughter drifts from the market square, and the soft murmur of voices weaves through the air. In this lull, the baker's mind drifts forward, to the next chapter of the day: afternoon croissants, rye loaves, the hush of closing. But for now, he is anchored to sweetness. Returning to the choux, he slides the baking trays into the hearth, careful to keep them level. The shells hiss as they meet the dry heat, and a delicate perfume of butter and steam drifts upward. He closes the oven door with a soft sigh and allows the pastries to rise in solitude. Meanwhile, he places the tart shells into a cooler corner of the hearth for blind baking, lining them with small discs of greased paper and buckshot to hold their shape. They too will spend a patient interval in the heat, then emerge with golden edges and sturdy bases ready to cradle vibrant jam. When the shell of pâte à choux has puffed and set, its crust taut and lightly browned, the baker reopens the oven. He stands for a moment, letting the warmth wash over him, then transfers the pastries to a floured board. They are hollow inside, crisp on the outside, perfect little vessels. He pierces each one with a small nozzle, filling them with a whisper of vanilla pastry cream or the gentle perfume of sweet custard. Some he leaves plain, whispering promises of sugar-dusted simplicity; others he readies for later glazing, a thin ribbon of chocolate or a sheen of fruit nectar to crown their ridges. At long last, the tartlets make their final passage. The baker threads a spoon through jars of deep amber apricot jam, stirring it until it glows like liquid sunlight. With a teaspoon, he pools the jam into each tiny shell, careful not to spill over the edges. Then, in a ritual of quiet ceremony, he sprinkles a breath of granulated sugar across the surface, just enough to catch the light, to give a gentle crackle beneath each tender bite. He pauses to consider the rows of pastries before him, shells of choux and rings of tart, each brimful with its promise of sweetness and calm. He arranges them gently on a polished tray of pewter and carries them to the shop's display. The morning has nearly paused at this point. Shoppers wander by, pausing to admire the neat array, the subtle harmony of curves and colors. Even the regulars who came for bread slow their stride, drawn by that hint of sugar on the breeze, that soft sheen of jam against golden pastry. Through the open doorway, the distant clatter of pans and the gentle murmur of greetings rise like a song. The baker steps back, his hands folded behind him, and watches as the first of the new day's patrons pause to choose their treat. In the stillness that follows, he allows himself a small, contented smile. The sun has fully climbed now, and the bakery is suffused with warm light. Flower dust motes drift in shafts of radiance, and the harpsichord strains of a street musician's melody float in from the lane. The chapter of bread is complete, its loaves already on their way to be sliced and eaten. Ahead lies the rhythmic work of afternoon croissants and rye loaves, the ledger awaiting pen and ink. But for this sweet morning, he stands in a quiet triumph, surrounded by the fruits of gentle diligence, tarts that glimmer with jam, eclairs that cradle pillars of cream, each one a simple offering of comfort and calm in 19th-century Paris. And as the first taste is savored at the counter, the city beyond the shutters hums its eager assent. Another day in the bakery's life, soft and golden, has begun. A pale light had finally begun to filter through the small windows of the bakery when the master baker turned his attention from the sweet fruit tarts to the most delicate of all his morning labors, the croissants. Outside, the first birds were stirring in the elm trees lining the lane, but inside, the workshop remained hushed, save for the faint hiss of steam from a kettle left on low and the quiet exhalations of the resting dough. In this muted hour, butter and dough would unite in precise harmony, and the baker approached his workbench with a respectful calm, as though entering a sanctuary. He wiped the smooth wooden surface one last time, checking for stray specks of flour or stray crumbs. Each imperfection, no matter how small, could interrupt the careful lamination that lay before him. Drawing a deep breath, he reached for the butter, which had spent the night in the coldest corner of the stone cellar. Firm yet pliable, it glowed pale yellow beneath the lantern's glow. The butter block, shaped the previous evening with exacting hands, was wrapped in parchment and tied with twine. He unwrapped it slowly, the rustle of paper punctuating the silence. With a steady, gloved hand, he lifted the butter block and placed it at the center of the counter. Next to it lay the dough, its surface smooth and cool, having been kneaded the day before and then allowed to relax. This dough had been prepared with strong French wheat flour, a pinch of fine sea salt, just enough water to bind, and a whisper of yeast to keep it soft. He dusted light wisps of flour across the bench, enough to prevent sticking but no more. Too much flour would make the croissants dry and heavy, betraying the airy elegance they required. He set to work rolling out the butter into a thin, even sheet. With a long, rectangular rolling pin, he pressed firmly from the center outward, nudging the butter into a uniform rectangle about half a centimeter thick. As the butter flattened, the edges softened slightly. He corrected them with a sharp bench scraper, trimming ragged tips until the outline was neat and precise. The pâtisserie of Paris demanded nothing less. Then came the dough. He dusted the bench again, picked up his rolling pin, and began to coax the dough into a larger rectangle. Each roll elongated the mass, and he paused to rotate it every few strokes, ensuring even thickness. The dough glistened faintly, its gluten strand stretched but unbroken. He looked for any thin spots or irregularities, smoothing them out so that the butter would lie flush within. When both elements lay ready, he brushed off any lingering flour from the butter block surface and slid it onto one half of the dough. With careful fingers, he folded the dough's free edge over the butter, enclosing it completely in a neat envelope. Corners met on the underside, there was no seam on top. He pressed gently along the edges to seal the package, then turned it seam side down. The butter, locked within, awaited the first in a series of folds that would stretch and layer it into countless sheets. He paused to survey his work, a rectangle of dough, smooth and pale, 20 centimeters across. On the wall clock, the minute hand moved imperceptibly. The bakery was warming now, the hearth at the far end glowed lightly from the smoldering embers tended earlier. The baker allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Each fold he would make now was both technical procedure and creative expression, linking generations of pastry tradition. The same movements had shaped croissants in simpler kitchens, in grand palaces, in village inns. He felt connected to that long line of hands, each one mastering the art in its own rhythm. With renewed concentration, he began the first book fold. He rolled the dough-encased butter away from him, stretching it to roughly 50 centimeters in length, then folded 1/3 toward the center and the other third over that, like closing the covers of a slender book. The layers formed new strata, butter between dough, dough between butter. He pressed lightly along the seam to seal it, then dusted the surface with a scant sprinkle of flour to prevent sticking. Turning the dough 90 degrees, he repeated the roll, pushing outward, rotating, lengthening, and folded again. This second folio, known as a double turn, multiplied the layers still further. Between each rolling and folding, he rested the dough on a marble slab chilled from the cellar. A linen cloth was draped over it to protect the surface from drafts and dust. In the dim glow, the dough lay in repose, as if breathing slowly, its structure calming and the butter solidifying again within. The baker timed these rests carefully, too short, and the butter would smear, too long, and the dough would cool beyond its malleable point. He kept a low fire in the hearth to maintain an even warmth, but the workshop itself remained cool, the crack of dawn air drifting in through a slight opening at the top of the door. After the first 2 folds and rests, he took up the parchment-wrapped dough once more. Now the rectangular mass was supple, the stripes of butter faintly visible at the cut edges. He performed 2 more letter folds, folding the bottom third up, then the top third down, each one preserving the warmth of his hands in the dough's pliant layers. Between folds, he admired the precise creases that had formed, each one a promise of the pastry's future flakiness. The 4th and final fold was the longest. He rolled out the dough to its final dimensions, careful to maintain straight edges and consistent thickness. Under his pin, the dough shimmered slightly, translucent in places where the butter lay closest to the surface. With a gentle hand, he folded again in thirds, pressing lightly to seal the edges. The result was a compact block, the culmination of nearly an hour's faith in time, temperature, and touch. He brushed again with flour, just enough to catch stray moisture, then wrapped the block in fresh parchment and tied it with twine. This time, he placed it on a cool shelf at the back of the bakery, where the temperature hovered just above that of the cellar. There, it would rest for at least half an hour, allowing the gluten to relax around the butter layers and the flavors to mature further. While the laminated dough lay to rest, the baker turned his attention to cleaning. He brushed stray flour from the table, wiped his tools with a damp cloth, and returned the rolling pins to their hooks. The hearth's glow had softened, embers turning gray as the heat settled. It was a moment of calm in a morning that had already seen fire, steam, and the golden birth of bread and pastries. The polished brass scale reflected the hazy light as he hung it back in place. In the quiet interlude, he reflected on the ritual he had just performed. The croissant's many layers were a metaphor for times past, the simple wheat of the countryside, the churned cream of Normandy, the gentle hands of pastry makers who came before. Soon, he would retrieve the dough, roll it out one final time, cut it into triangles, and shape each croissant with a precise roll toward the tip. But that would be in a few moments, once the dough was ready. For now, he allowed himself to savor the calm, the gentle anticipation of both pastry and sunrise. Outside, the street had grown brighter. The first customers of the day, en route to the market or heading inward to the boulevards, would soon catch the scent of butter and bread curling from beneath the shutters. Within these walls, the baker honored a centuries-old craft with care and reverence, each fold a note in a laminated symphony that would reach its crescendo in golden, flaked crescents. In this soft light, he felt both custodian and composer, guiding simple ingredients through a deliberate dance until they emerged transformed, ready to become the quiet promise of a new day. The sun stands high above the rooftops now, its gentle warmth spilling through the bakery's front windows and bathing every surface in a soft, honeyed glow. Inside, the air has settled, the steady hum of ovens and lanterns has quieted, and the rhythm of urgent footsteps on wooden floors has slackened into a slow, almost reverent pace. For a moment, time itself seems to pause, as though acknowledging the brief reprieve that follows the morning's bustle. It is in this slender interval, between the last crusty boule fetched by the blacksmith's apprentice and the first coil of rye dough awaiting its turn, that the baker finds space for a different kind of labor, the caretaking of his own workshop, the reflection upon his morning's labors, and the careful accounting of all he has produced and placed into the hands of his neighbors. He reaches for a linen cloth, once crisp and white, now textured with fine lines of flour and the faintest smudges of butter. Folding it with a respectful gentleness, he presses it against the broad wooden table where croissants cooled only an hour before. His palm moves in measured circles, tracing aromatic patterns of leftover crumbs and droplets of glaze. With each sweep, the cloth absorbs the traces of work, minuscule flakes of pastry, the faint trace of apricot jam, the almost invisible sheen of sugar crystals. The gesture is at once restorative and meditative, as though he were wiping away not only the debris of his craft but also any lingering turbulence in his own thoughts. As he wipes, he pauses sometimes to inhale deeply. The scent of warm wood mingles with a distant hint of lavender from his morning tea and the enduring musk of well-aged flour. He allows himself a gentle smile, recalling the first tender bubble of proofing dough discovered hours before, and the proud moment when each loaf he scored slipped gracefully from paddle to hearth. In this soft light, the bakery seems to sigh in contentment, as though grateful for the quiet that follows the forging heat of the ovens. When the table gleams once more, the baker sets the cloth aside and exchanges it for a sturdy broom of bound straw. With deliberate strokes, he sweeps the floor, sending motes of flour dancing in stray beams of sunlight. His movement is slow and even, hands guiding the broom as if he were shaping dough itself, firm yet yielding, attentive to the clay floor's every nick and groove. Grain by grain, the fine white powder is gathered into tidy piles, carried off toward a waiting dustpan propped in the corner. There is something almost ceremonial in the act, a way of honoring the rhythm of his day by clearing away the past and making ready for what is to come. While the broom passes over these familiar boards, the baker's mind drifts to the morning's exchanges, Madame Fournier praising the flakiness of today's croissants, young Marcel declaring the baguettes the best he's ever tasted before slipping his coins onto the counter, the blacksmith's apprentice who lingered, tucking a half-smile behind his soot-streaked cheek. He recalls the warmth in their eyes, the soft murmur of appreciation, and for a moment feels deeply anchored to this small corner of Paris. The city outside remains busy, carriages rumble past, a distant murmur of voices drifts through the semi-open door, but here, within this hushed expanse, all is measured, all is still. When the sweeping is complete, the baker sets the broom against the wall and pads across the floor to a low stool where a worn leather-bound ledger rests. Its cover is creased with time, the spine soft from years of opening and closing. He lifts it gently, as though it were a fragile artifact, and places it on the table he has just finished cleaning. Beside it sits a small porcelain inkwell, its dark contents glinting like ink-black oil, and a slender quill with a nib trimmed to the perfect angle for crisp strokes. He dips the pen, and the nib captures a bead of ink, quivering slightly before releasing its burden onto the page. Across the laid columns he inscribes the day's yield: 36 baguettes, 24 boules, 15 croissants, 12 fruit tarts, and 18 eclairs. Next to each number, he notes the sums taken: 28 baguettes sold to passers-by, 8 reserved for a neighboring café, 16 croissants gone before the church bells chimed 8, and the eclairs, offered with a gentle half-price to children on their way to school, all claimed before the morning's end. Each figure is rendered with certainty, the quill's fine lines testament to the precision of his care. With each notation, he reflects on the balance between abundance and restraint. The ledger is more than a record, it is a mirror of his craft, showing where demand outstripped supplication and where small adjustments are needed. Here, the croissants nearly ran out before the window was fully raised. There, the tarts lingered longer than expected, tempting him to consider a slight reduction in sugar or a shift in fruit choice. The commerce of bread and pastry is measured not only in numbers but in the unspoken rhythms of daily life: who arrives first, who lingers, who returns again tomorrow. In that pause between pen strokes, he feels the quiet pulse of the bakery and its woven ties to the street outside. When the last entry is made, the baker closes the ledger and wipes away a stray ink spot with the sleeve of his linen shirt. He lifts the book and places it on a low shelf, alongside journals of seasons past and the slender account books passed down from his father. Each volume carries its own whispered history: the winter of 1832, when wheat was scarce; the spring of 1848, when voices rose in protest and flour grew dearer by the week; the summer of 1855, when the Exposition Universelle sent more visitors through Paris than ever before. He reveres these pages, for they speak of resilience, persistence, and the unbroken thread of mornings spent coaxing sustenance from flour and water and fire. In the silence that follows, the baker straightens, letting a small stretch bring circulation back to his shoulders. He glances toward the rear of the shop, where a new batch of dark rye flour and molasses stands ready in burlap sacks. Soon, he will return to kneading and shaping, to the deeper, earthier alchemy of alternative grains. But for now, he allows himself one more moment of pause, his brow smooth, his breath even and calm, the soft lamplight pooling around him like a quiet benediction. From outside comes the distant tolling of Saint Etienne's bells, a gentle summons to shift from contemplation to action. The midday lull slips away like a soft exhale, leaving behind the clarity of purpose that only comes from stillness. As the baker moves toward his workbench once more, he carries with him the quiet satisfaction of a morning well tended, the gleaming surfaces, the swept floors, the exacting entries in his ledger, all affirmations of a craft grounded in patience, dedication, and the simple grace of bread shared with community. And so, with that quiet resolve, he prepares to greet the afternoon's tasks, mixing coarse rye dough, guiding its deeper flavors, and shaping loaves that will nourish another wave of hungry Parisians. But first, he pauses at the threshold of the storage alcove, lays a hand against the cool stone wall, and smiles. For even in this brief interval of calm, he knows that the heart of the bakery beats steadily onward, from dawn to dusk, day after day, in the gentle, unending ritual of the oven's glow. A hush settles over the bakery as the weak glare of the midday sun gives way to the gentler light of early afternoon. The morning's bustle has receded into a soft murmur of exchanged greetings and the distant clatter of wooden carts beyond the street. Under the warm glow of the cellar lamp, the baker pauses in the center of his workspace, hands still faintly dusted with flour, the corners of his linen apron speckled with stray crumbs. He breathes steadily, taking measure of the quiet triumph that followed the morning's flurry of baguettes and croissants. Now, with the first ledger entries made and tools rested, he turns to the next ritual, the preparation of the afternoon's rye and specialty breads, those hearty loaves that lend the bakery its seasonal character. He gathers his materials in deliberate sequence. First comes the measure of dark rye flour, its ashen brown hue reminiscent of autumn fields after harvest. Each scoop is weighed with precision upon the brass scale, 200 grams, 500 grams, half a kilogram, until the mound of grain murmurs with promise. He lifts a small iron scoop, weighing out just enough molasses to sweeten the rough tang of rye without overwhelming it. The molasses drips slowly from the scoop, a ribbon of deep amber that coils into the flour like spreading sunlight. A pinch of salt, fine-grained, pale, glinting faintly under the lamp, joins the mixture. Finally, he sprinkles in a spoonful of active yeast, its granules like soft sand ready to awaken at the touch of moisture and warmth. The mixing trough stands at the baker's side, its wooden sides worn smooth by countless mornings of kneading. He shovels the dry blend into the trough's cavity, the loose grains tumbling in muted countermelody. Then he tilts a small copper pitcher of lukewarm water, pouring it in a slow, steady stream that spirals through the dark flour. Each droplet dissolves the molasses at the edges, creating streaks of toffee-colored dough in a sea of rye. With a broad spatula of maple wood, he begins the stirring, circles, spirals, folds, until the rough mass begins to cohere. A soft hiss of flour meets water, grains clinging to the edge of the paddle. The mixture resists, heavy and dense, but it yields, inch by inch, inviting his hands to the task. He pauses, wipes his brow with the back of his hand, and dusts the kneading board with a scattering of rye bran. The coarse husks crackle under his fingers, their bristly texture a reminder of the grain's rustic origin. A final handful of bran is sprinkled atop the dough ball, imparting a speckled surface that will crisp in the oven. His hands slip into the pliant mass, fingers splayed to catch every strand of gluten developing within. He presses firmly, then tucks each corner beneath itself, coaxing the dough into a roughly rectangular shape. The resistance is immediate, firmer than wheat, and it demands measured strength. He leans into it, using the heel of his palm to push the dough away, then gathers it back with one swift turn. The dough hums beneath his hands, striations forming like ring patterns in a felled tree. Each fold builds structure, quarters folded into halves, halves tucked again, until the dough's surface shines faintly with needed effort. The baker's breathing slows to a steady rhythm as the dough becomes supple, though still dense. He feels the warmth that has built in the trough, the gentle frictions of gluten bonds knitting together. Small beads of moisture appear along the seam, glistening like morning dew on the skin of fruit. Satisfied, he shapes the dough into a tight, oblong form. The tapered ends are pinched and rolled until the loaf holds itself, its bulging center and tapered tips reminiscent of a sturdy canoe fashioned of grain. He sets this first loaf aside on a cloth-lined proofing board and begins the next. A mélange of spelt and barley flour arrives in a separate burlap sack, lighter in color but equally aromatic. Here, too, he repeats the ritual: molasses and yeast, water and salt, each measured against the brass scale's quiet clink. The dough for regional specialty breads, some enriched with crushed anise seeds, others flecked with cracked wheat, takes shape in parallel troughs. The anise lends a faint licorice note, subtle enough that it will surprise the nose at first bite. The cracked wheat loaf offers an altogether different texture, shards of grain that punctuate the crumb with chewy bursts. He kneads each mass by hand, alternating between troughs to keep the pace even, the motions rhythmic: press, fold, rotate, repeat. As he works, the afternoon light through the small grate in the bakery's rear wall shifts from cool white to warm gold. Shadows lengthen across the wooden counter, pooling beneath rows of rising dough. A gentle warmth emanates from the hearth, now hushed but still radiant. He checks the temperature with a slender iron rod. It remains steady, low enough to encourage a slow proof but sufficient to coax the yeast into steady activity. A whisper of steam curls in the air every time he opens the shutter to adjust the logs inside the oven. He decides against adding any more wood just yet, allowing the residual heat to breathe life into the rye and specialty doughs. Once the final loaf is gently rounded and proofing, he steps back. The bakery hums with possibilities: the faint sweet scent of molasses, the heavier, earthy tang of rye, and the nuanced perfume of spelt, barley, and anise. He smooths the cloth covers over the proofing boards, shielding the loaves from drafts, and murmurs a short blessing, a quiet gesture of gratitude for each grain's journey from field to flour. Moments of calm follow. He wipes the paddle clean, sweeps stray bran from the floor, and returns to his ledger, jotting down the dough weights and anticipated bake times. Outside, the city's rhythm shifts, the clamor of midday markets retreats, replaced by the softer pulse of late afternoon errands. Pedestrians pause before the bakery's window, drawn by the promise of new flavors. The baker stands at the threshold, lantern in hand, and watches as the first neighbor stops to inquire whether the rye loaves are nearly ready. He offers a gentle smile and nods, then moves back into the glow of the interior. Soon, the moment will come to slide these dense loaves into the rebounding heat of the hearth, where they will emerge in deeper shades of amber and russet. But for now, he lets patience govern his pace. The heartbeat of any good bread lies in the slow communion between time, temperature, and touch. As the afternoon deepens toward evening, the rye and specialty loaves rest in silent promise, awaiting the second hearth to bring their hidden textures and flavors fully to life. As the soft glow of an oil lamp flickers against the rich, honeyed timbers of the bakery walls, the master baker stands before his second hearth, palms resting lightly on the worn wooden peel. The late afternoon light filters through the high window panes, touching motes of flour dust suspended in the still air. A faint hiss rises from the oven's heart, where embers held steady by centuries of ritual await their next burden. In this gentle half-light, the baker prepares to coax from flame and grain the afternoon's second harvest: hearty rye loaves, tender brioches, and an array of specialty breads that will round out the day's offerings. He pauses a moment, inhaling the mingled scents of sweet butter and earthy malt. The warmth of the hearth seeps through his linen shirt, imparting a reassuring steadiness to his hands. Behind him, a low shelf bears proofing baskets draped in flour-dusty cloth, each one cradling dough now swollen with life. A brief glance to the ledger on the counter confirms today's yield. Midday tarts and croissants have flown quickly into the eager hands of shopkeepers and early risers. The afternoon must now satisfy a different palate, the robust hunger of laborers returning with shake of shoulders, of households seeking sustenance for the evening meal. He lifts a portion of dense rye dough from its resting place, brushing away stray granules of bran. The interior is cool to the touch, resilient yet pliant. With practiced dexterity, he reshapes the mound into a compact oval, coaxing a taut skin across its surface. His thumbs press a shallow groove along the loaf's length, a guiding ridge that will open under the oven's heat like a silent promise of yielding crumb and crackling crust. Against the cold stone floor, he lines the formed loaves in neat rows, spacing each one so that they may breathe and expand without constraint. On a nearby table, brioche dough, rich with cream and beaten eggs, is weighed and divided into small, generous rounds. Their pale, buttery hue gleams faintly even under the lamp's subdued light. He rolls a piece between his palms, letting the warmth of his skin ease the dough into an oval. Another palm's press flattens its center, while the other deftly tucks the edges underneath, yielding a smooth, domed form that hints at the pastry's eventual flakiness. Each mound is gently deposited in a floured tin, the indentations carefully aligned so that, when baked, they will rise in symphonic unison. It is a ritual balanced between art and necessity. The rye, with its firm, rust-colored bran, will bake into substantial loaves that sustain the body. The brioche, enriched with sugar and fat, will offer an indulgent counterpoint for those seeking a sweeter end to their day. Elsewhere, small specialty breads await, fennel-seeded rolls for a neighboring inn, slender olive-studded batards for the pâtisserie upstairs, and cheese-topped flatbreads destined for the café along the boulevard. Each piece, though varied in form and flavor, is born of the same elemental process: grain, water, yeast, salt, time, and each will find its place upon the bakery's display at eventide. With all trays loaded, the baker slides the brass-rimmed shelf into the oven's mouth. The door closes with a dull thud, and he seals the gap with a clay stopper, ensuring the heat will circulate evenly. Leaning close to the hearth, he inserts a narrow metal rod through one of the vents, easing it into the ember chamber. The hiss of temperature meeting moisture is like a steady heartbeat. He traces the warmth through the iron door with his palm, gauging the internal climate that will shape crumb and crust alike. As the first minutes pass, he turns his attention to the display. By lamplight, he rearranges the wooden boards, resetting the morning's loaves to one side and preparing another tier for the new arrivals. The display case, once fully illuminated by dawn, now requires a subtler choreography of light and shadow. He positions a small oil lamp beneath a green glass shade, its glow radiating warmth onto the golden crusts and deep russets above. The effect is homely, almost hearth-like, inviting passers-by to linger before the shop window and savor the unwritten promise of evening sustenance. While the dough transforms to bread within the oven, the baker brushes down the workbench with the slender whisk he uses to dispatch lingering flour. The air feels nearly still, save for the gentle breath of the lamp's flame. Moments stretch in the hush, and he allows himself a brief respite to reflect in the ledger's margin. The rye dough this afternoon rose more swiftly than anticipated, and the brioche turns exhibit a pleasing honeycomb structure. Small annotations guide future bakings, perhaps a fraction more molasses for the rye, a touch less sugar for the brioche shell. A light knock at the shuttered door draws him from his thoughts. Polishing his palms on his apron, he unlatches the bolt and peers out onto the narrow street. A young porter from the wine shop stands with a nod, requesting a loaf of the day's rye for a late delivery. The baker selects one from the newly formed row, feeling its firm weight, and wraps it in coarse paper. He exchanges a few quiet words, settling an account, promising another tomorrow, before the porter departs, loaf in hand, treads echoing away on the cobblestones. Returning to the hearth, the baker senses a shift in the oven's breath. He pushes back the stopper and, peering within, notes how the loaves have subtly curved, their slashes opening to reveal pale interiors. With the peel, he lifts each tray carefully, rotating from front to back to ensure an even hue. The rye's surface is deepening to a mahogany tone, and the brioche crowns have swelled into perfect, glossy domes. One by one, he transfers the finished breads onto the cooling rack, an antiqued iron grate that allows air to circulate beneath each loaf, preserving crust and crumb in equal measure. He steps back to admire the results, rows of rye standing stoic and substantial, brioches beckoning with sweet, buttery promise, and a medley of specialty shapes glinting with seeds or slivered cheese. The display, now fully replenished, glows like a tableau of nourishment in the gathering dusk. Each loaf is a silent announcement that in this modest Parisian bakery, the ancient art of bread-making endures, renewed with patient hands and steady hearths. As the final tray empties, the baker closes the oven door and tends the ember bed. He brushes loose ash into a cast-iron pan and smooths the surface with a flat stone tool. The hearth, though still warm, is retreating to embers once more. He lowers the lamp, dims the wick slightly, and secures the shutters against the chill of evening. Tomorrow's dawn will see the entire ritual begin anew, the prelude of cold water on his hands, the lantern-lit journey through the silent streets, and the birthing of dough by firelight. But for now, with the second hearth's labor complete, he stands amid the savory hush of a bakery fulfilled. In this calm hour, he allows a moment to savor the quiet triumph of afternoon tradition. The crates by the door wait to be loaded onto carts for delivery, the ledger rests open with the day's final entries. Outside, Paris unfurls into twilight, lanterns winking alive along the boulevards. Inside, the oven's warmth lingers in the stone floors, the walls still echoing with the shaping of dough. And as the baker extinguishes the lamp's wick, he carries the gentle assurance that once more, he has woven flame and grain into sustenance for a waiting world. As the sun dipped below the slate rooftops of Paris and the rosy sky faded to the soft violet of approaching dusk, the baker stood in the warm glow of his shop's interior. The day's bustle had quieted, the clatter of wooden peels and the hiss of steam from the hearth were now distant memories. Lanterns mounted above the display shelves cast long, gentle shadows across rows of crusty loaves, delicate croissants, and little fruit tarts whose morning vibrancy had softened. In this half-light, every surface gleamed faintly with a fine film of flour or sugar, as though the entire bakery wore a dusting of last night's memory. He moved slowly along the front counter, a length of polished wood that bore the faint scratches of decades. With a small piece of chalk, he began the ritual of marking down unsold pastries. The slender fruits of his labors, plump éclairs filled with coffee-scented cream, jewel-bright jam tartlets, slender pain au raisins spiraled with custard, marked this hour with a whisper of timidity and a gentle letting go. Each chalked numeral, a neat 50% or 30%, softened the edge of freshness, drawing in the occasional late stroller who might pause at the window. He worked patiently, dipping the chalk from time to time on his apron to sharpen its tip, his large hands precise in motion despite a day spent lifting heavy sacks of grain and kneading sticky dough. The door chime tinkled at irregular intervals. A lamplighter, returning home from distant streets, stooped to buy a modest cluster of day-old rolls. He exchanged a brief nod with the baker, loose coins clinking in a leather pouch as the baker counted out the change, a silver sou, a copper denier, the warm weight of copper and silver passing from hand to hand. Across the threshold came the parish sexton, carrying a small lantern, nodding in greeting. She selected a rum-spiced brioche, its flaky layers now settled into gentle curves, and waited with patience while he wrapped it in brown parchment. The baker tied the package with a scrap of twine, looping the ends in a simple bow. Bonne soirée, she murmured, voice hushed, stepping back into the early evening mist. With each departure, the shop grew quieter still. The battered door swung shut and locked with a soft click, leaving behind only the muted echoes of footsteps on the cobblestones. The baker paused at the threshold, rubbing his hands together as the cool draft touched his wrists. He noticed the amber glow of an oil lamp near the till, its flame swaying in a gentle rhythm that seemed to match the slow beating of his heart. He turned back to the center of the room and retrieved a small, oil-stained ledger from a low shelf. The leather-bound book lay open upon the counter, its pages creased where names and numbers had been inscribed since first light. With a stub of quill and a ceramic inkwell half full of sepia-brown ink, he began to record the final sales. First the breads, 20 large boules sold to the boulanger down the street, a dozen slender baguettes to the carriage driver's stable side, and half a dozen modest baguettes wrapped in paper for the milkmaid who lived above the dairy. He paused to blot the ink with a strip of blotting paper, blotting slowly so that each character would remain clear come morning. Next, the pastries, 14 pain au chocolate delivered to a scholar at the university, 6 almond croissants for the seamstress who would need an evening snack while she stitched by candlelight, and the discounted tarts, tallying their reduced price with the same care he once had at the dawn's first hour. The rhythmic scratching of quill on page was comforting, a final counterpoint to the earlier cacophony of rising dough and the roar of the oven. Outside, a distant bell tolled 8 times, each chime a reminder that the Paris day had turned at last toward its close. Then came the delicate task of balancing the till. The small oak chest was lined with red felt, its compartments brimming with coins of varying size and metal. He arranged copper deniers in neat little piles, counting by fives. Silver sous were carefully stacked 2 by 2, the occasional gold pistole or Spanish doubloon, received as rare payment for a custom loaf, was set aside in a deeper recess. By the lamplight, the coins gleamed like tiny burnt orange moons. He jotted subtotals on the ledger's margin: cuivre total, 3.45, argent total, 12.80, and then added them together, the final sum confirming the day's earnings. A faint breeze whispered beneath the doorframe, carrying with it the scent of rain on hot stone. The baker paused, eyes drawn to the small window behind the counter. The street lamps, now lit, stood sentinel along the cobbles, their glowing globes drifting through the swirling mist. Somewhere beyond, horses were stabled for the night, and a lone flute sounded soft and plaintive, playing a tune borrowed from a market-day ballad. He closed the oak till and ran a finger along the edge of the closed lid. The weight of the day's work, both physical and measured in coin, was a quiet comfort. It was enough heat to warm a family's hearth, enough sweetness to lift a solitary child's spirits, enough crusty loaf to fill the emptiest stomach. More than enough, perhaps, in the grand scheme of Parisian life. He tapped the side of the till twice, a small ritual gesture akin to a benediction, before slipping the chest under the counter. The lantern's flame flickered once, as though in applause, then settled into a steady glow. He gathered the day-old breads, now lined up on a shallow brass tray, and carried them to a corner shelf. There, he covered them with a coarse linen cloth, folding the fabric carefully over each edge so that tomorrow's apprentice, arriving before sunrise, would find them dry and ready for repurposing into croutons, breadcrumbs, or the classic pain perdu. A strand of sunlight, long since vanished, was replaced by the lamp's mellow radiance, which softly illuminated the bread's rough, cracked surfaces. Every motion at this hour was deliberate, slow, almost ceremonial. He brushed away stray crumbs from the counter with a stiff bristled brush, collecting them in a small porcelain dish that would feed the chickens in the courtyard. He checked once more that the ledgers were stowed safely in the deepest drawer of his desk, locked with a brass key whose ornate teeth had been filed and refitted so often that they gleamed with constant use. Finally, he took a moment to stand in the center of the shop. The ovens were cold now, the worn door was propped ajar so that any final embers would not smolder in the dark. Proofing baskets, racks, and wooden boards lay in neat rows against one wall, as though paused mid-dance. The sink, where his hands had been washed countless times throughout the day, bore the last beads of water from a final rinse. Flour-dusted floorboards, once ankle-deep in white powder, were swept clean until the wood grain peeked through. He breathed deeply, inhaling the mingled scents of grain, sugar, and the faintest smoky note from the hearth. In that quiet moment, no customers, no clamor, no rising dough, he felt the gentle satisfaction of another day's work brought to completion. He reached out and cradled the oil lamp, its glass chimney cool beneath his fingers, then lifted it to eye level. The warm light cast his shadow against the wall, tall and still. Au revoir, he whispered to the silent shop, voice soft as falling flour, promising to return with the moon still high and to greet the dawn as he had done every morning. With one last glance at the neatly balanced till, the chalked-down pastries, and the ready supplies for next day's labors, he made his way to the back room. There, the door was secured, the last click echoing in the stillness. The winding key turned in the lock, a gentle exclamation point at the end of the day. Outside, the last call of vendors drifted through the cool evening air. Yet in this small bakery, everything was in rightful order. The day's accounts were settled, the counters wiped, the ovens silenced. Now, beneath the dim shimmer of the oil lamp and the hush of gathering night, the baker stepped into the evening, carrying in his heart the deep, unspoken promise of tomorrow's gentle dawn ritual. The lanterns had long since been dimmed to a faint glow, the edges of their metal casings gathering soft shadows across the worn floorboards. In the hush that followed the day's bustle, the bakery seemed to exhale, settling into a patient promise of rest before the returning dawn. The baker moved slowly among the workbenches and counters, his hands returning once more to the tasks that signaled an end as much as they honored the craft. Each motion was deliberate, weighted with history, as if in these final acts he folded the day's labors into the very timbers of the shop. Night pressed gently against the windows, and the hearth, now cooled to warm embers, offered him the last crackling whispers of its flame. First, he donned a simple linen glove to reach into the hearth. With a small metal shovel he carefully scooped out glowing cinders that refused to surrender to darkness. The ritual was familiar. He transferred each ember into a heavy iron container, layer by layer letting them dim beneath a blanket of fine ash. As each spark was stifled, the heat waned until only a soft warmth remained, its life turned inward. The baker paused, placing his palm above the covered hearth, tasting the residual glow on his skin. This quiet moment, watching the ashes settle, reminded him that even in extinguishment there lived a memory of flame. Turning away from the hearth, he retrieved a bundle of utensils, wooden peels, brass pans, and flour-dusted paddles, and set them in neat stacks upon a low shelf. He brushed each one tenderly, removing stray grains of wheat and tiny fragments of crust that clung to their edges. The peels were oiled in spots where wood and metal met, ensuring that tomorrow's dough would slide effortlessly onto the oven floor. Side by side, bowls and rolling pins found their places in cupboards whose doors he closed with a small click, sealing in the fragrance of oats and rye until morning's light coaxed them free again. The soft click of latches closing, of bolts sliding into place, wove a quiet cadence through the shop. His next task was the sweeping of the floor. He took up the bristled broom, woven from stiff horsehair, and began at one corner, brushing breadcrumbs back toward the entrance. Each stroke revealed more of the wood's patina, the mixed browns and golds polished by years of footfall and flour. The broom felt steady in his grip, and as dust and husks of bran gathered into a neat pile, the bakery floor transformed from evidence of labor to a blank canvas awaiting tomorrow's steps. The baker gathered the sweepings with a hand-carved dustpan, tipping them into a small bucket for disposal outside. Outside the back door, beneath a canopy of wrought iron brackets, he emptied the remnants into the alley's refuse and listened to the faint echo as they fell, another gentle sign that the day was concluded. He replaced the broom in its corner cradle and drew a damp cloth from a basket of clean linens. The surface of the large central table was worn smooth, each groove and dent a memoir of kneading, rolling, and shaping. Dipping the cloth in cool water, he wiped along its length in measured strokes. The aroma of yeast and salt mingled with the freshness of the damp cloth, carrying memories of the morning's first dough resting under its linen cloak, and of the afternoon's rye loaves heavy with molasses. With each pass of the cloth, the baker honored both the dust of flour and the promise of a spotless work surface for tomorrow's creations. Beside the table stood the ledger, propped open under the flicker of a single surviving candle. Its pages bore the tally of loaves sold, pastries dispatched, and yield set down in the baker's careful script. He ran his finger along the figures, the number of baguettes first to vanish beneath the neighbor's early hunger, the count of brioche luxuriously glazed for afternoon appetite, and the handful of rye loaves reserved for the blacksmith's hearty requests. Satisfied that the sums balanced, he traced a line beneath the day's entries and closed the book. The embossed leather cover snapped shut, and with a soft pat he slid it into a drawer, content that the numerical record matched the tactile fulfillment of the oven's bounty. The lantern on the front counter was the last source of light now. The baker set it aside, gathering its wick and wiping down its glass chimney before extinguishing the flame with a careful breath. Darkness settled unhurriedly, and the shop felt as though it slept, the surfaces breathing in the cool quiet. He approached the front door and took the key from the hook nearby, a bit of worn iron, polished by countless evenings of service. With deliberate slowness he slipped the key into the lock, twisting until the bolt moved free. The final click that echoed through the chamber was a tender punctuation to the day's long story. He paused in the threshold, his hand resting on the knob, and closed his eyes. Beyond the door lay the silent street, shutters drawn on neighboring windows, cobblestones gleaming faintly beneath moonlight, and the distant chiming of a solitary clock marking the hour. Here, in this suspended moment, time itself felt cushioned, as if the city exhaled too. The baker inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the layered scents of earth, grain, and wood, an essence that promised resurrection with the return of dawn. He allowed himself one lingering heartbeat of stillness before he turned the knob and stepped out. The cool Paris air embraced him as he crossed the threshold, the hush of night stretching its arms around his shoulders. His footsteps landed softly on the uneven stones as he made his way back along the narrow lane toward the small dwelling above the bakery. Passing under the wrought iron balcony where climbing roses slept beneath the night sky, he felt the day's dust settle away with each footstep. Arriving home, he removed his linen coat and boots by the door, setting them neatly aside. A short corridor led him into a tiny kitchen warmed by a gentle hearth fire. In its amber light he washed his hands in cold water one last time, scrubbing away the day's impressions from fingertips that would awaken before dawn to begin it all anew. Finally, he climbed the narrow stairs to the small room where a simple cot awaited him. The quilt was folded at the foot of the pallet, hand-stitched in muted stripes of gray and cream. He pulled it over himself, tucking the corner beneath his chin as the day's last thoughts drifted upward. He recalled the laughter of early customers greeting their crusted loaves, the sigh of satisfaction as a fresh croissant flaked beneath a gentle bite, the quiet pulse of steam hissing through the oven vents. Each memory came tinted in lamplight gold and gentle heat, tracing a soft map of gratitude across his mind. As sleep claimed him, the baker drifted toward a world of hushed anticipation, a horizon still dark, figures moving in silhouette beside the hearth, the rhythmic turn of wheat into dough, and the soft crackle of fire. The quiet triumphs of the day remained etched in his chest, ready to be rekindled when the clock's hands circled back to those first silent hours. And in the deep shade of night, with the key turned and the shop safely closed, the bakery breathed its final exhale, resolute, waiting, and lovingly poised for the gentle dawn rituals that would soon begin again.